Hey everybody, welcome to the Friday 3D Printing Community Hangout. Tonight we're joined with a special guest. We have Scott Lahteine, the head developer, main developer, only developer, depends how you want to look at it, of Marlin, the Marlin firmware that comes on almost every printer that you have sitting on your desk at home, and even some of you have at work. So we're going to kind of get started here real quick, let the whole panel go through introductions, tell you who they are and where you can find them, give you Patreon, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all that stuff. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm just going to start on my left and go down the line. So let's start with Kat.
Hello, my name is Katja, a.k.a. Cat 3D. I have a small little YouTube channel since February 2017. And the first thing that I started off with was a Delta printer, which I assembled from a Chinese producer. And I was very proud to get it finished, and since then I added lots of other printers. I built a second one, which was a Blocks Zero, and both. So when I heard that you guys are gonna be part of the stream, I decided to get out of bed at 4 o'clock a.m. my time. So I'm living in Liechtenstein to be part of this. Okay.
Nice.
All right. Next up, we've got Chris. I'm going to say Chris P.
Oh, Chris P. So that's me. Good evening, everybody. Chris Pelesky here. I am Chris P1 on the Twitters. One of the EARF co-founders. Check out our website, eastcoastreprapfestival.com. Really looking forward tonight and talking with Scott, hearing some about him. I met him last year at MRF for the first time, and then EARF after that, and really looking forward to tonight. So thanks for coming out.
All right. Next up, we've got Practical Chris.
Me. That's me. I'm Chris Russell, Practical Printing. Been a little quiet on YouTube recently just because of some stuff that's happened in real life. But spring is here and things are, well, spring's not here yet, but spring's in my heart. It's here. So it's time to turn that around, get things going again. I interact with Scott a lot with Marlin. I'm kind of a hardware geek and know enough in code to be dangerous. So I'm really interested in the future of Marlin. I'm a big supporter.
All right. Next up, we've got Dave.
Hey, David Randolph. I'm over at Printed Solid. You find us on Twitter, Printed Solid, Facebook, Printed Solid, printedsolid.com. All the shameless ways to say Printed Solid. That's where you'd find me. You know, we've been huge supporters of Marlin and all its stuff, as well as other open source projects. And it's just an amazing software solution. And looking forward to hearing more from Scott.
All right. Next up, we've got Martin.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Marteinn. I have a channel called 3DP Iceland. Can be found on YouTube and Twitter and Twitch now. I'm starting to stream there as well. It's 3DP Iceland. I do a little bit of everything on my channel, filament reviews and painting, like those landscapes I've been doing. Did 2 of those on a stream today, and I'm saving up a lot of landscapes to bring to MRF, and I will be giving them away there. So currently I'm working on a Boba Fett model that I printed, and I do yeah, all kind of stuff, Star Wars now. So that's me.
Beautiful.
All right. And that leaves me. I'm Matt from How I Do It, and I haven't been doing a lot as far as YouTube and Instagram, but I'm always on Twitter. I do a little bit of everything: 3D printing, woodworking, metalworking, and just like to share the projects I'm working on and help anybody wherever I can give knowledge that others may not have. I try to input my opinion and my knowledge. But let's go ahead and move right over to Scott. Now we're going to give Scott and Lou the floor to tell you basically whatever they want as far as Marlin and about themselves. So Scott and Lou, go ahead.
Hey, how's it going? I'm Scott Lahteine, and this is my friend Lou.
How's it going?
Back.
I'm just going to be a fly on the wall here, so I won't be talking much.
Yeah, I do the basically the maintenance and lead development of Marlin, and for that purpose, I have this this place we've rented in Austin that is sort of our workshop and our living quarters. Lou is my right-hand man, and he's been helping me with testing and anything related to web development and just sort of putting everything together to, you know, that I can't necessarily do all day long. So I've got, you know, lots of tasks in Marlin. The issue queue is constantly full, so I try to get through that as much as I can. And so I don't get as much testing as I'd like in, and for that, and then I've been feeling bad about that for a while. So I was like, well, I need someone to help me. So that's why I brought Lou in, and is getting more versed in all the little aspects of what I do. And I'm just basically, you're my shadow while I'm doing things and sort of picking up the inside of what's going on and just how it all kind of comes together every day. So yeah. So that's my basic introduction would be, yeah, I've been a coder for a while. I grew up on Cape Cod, and beautiful place to grow up, but not a lot going on in the world of engineering and science that I was aware of. So I picked up computers and was really into like, you know, making games and stuff like that. And so I ended up making games for a while for like Amigas and playing with Atari computers in the 80s. And this kind of stuff I'm doing now reminds me a lot of that period of time where, you know, you could work on a very small computer that was, you know, only had a few K of RAM, and you had to make do with the resources that it had. And maybe you had to talk directly to the hardware to make it do all the tricks you needed to do. During all the time between the time I first started programming until kind of 3D printing came along, I was sort of floating between like doing web development and trying my hand at different types of coding, but nothing really clicked until I came to this kind of area again and discovered that, oh, people are playing with the smaller, not quite as, you know, powerful, not quite as super fast computers anymore. You know, they're playing with them again, and there's kind of new things happening. And ARM processors, which were invented in the 80s, are suddenly, you know, on the rise. They're in everybody's phones, and now they're starting to run 3D printers. And you know, it's just I realized I could get away from the desktop, maybe get away from the rectangles that the web kind of makes you think in, and start to play with things that are more dynamic. You know, maybe shock myself, burn myself with a soldering iron every so often, start to build things that are a little more interesting. And so yeah, so I migrated naturally towards the 3D printing area. And of course, the first thing I found when I came into 3D printing was there's the whole field of different hardware and open source software and some closed source. And if you were going to pick which printer you wanted or which firmware you wanted, there were a lot of choices out there. And it became clear to me very quickly that Marlin was kind of the most mature one. And the most general and kind of the most following the open source ethos of all the firmwares that was out there, and it seemed to be the most maintained. But all at the same time, it was kind of quiet. It had reached a certain plateau and was working well, and people were using it and they were happy with it. But when I came to it, it felt like there were a few things I wanted tweaked, and I'd have to wait a long time for those things to get adjusted. And so, of course, well, I'll do it myself. And so that's kind of how I fell in. I just wanted to make it better. And so I kind of started out doing that little by little. And then eventually I was doing it so much that that I was kind of doing it more than anybody else. And naturally fixing up things and just kind of building on that. And then, of course, once you start any kind of activity around a project like this, suddenly a lot more activity comes in. And so there was a huge influx of people coming in all of a sudden and contributing more and having ideas and being pissed off because you broke something that they really liked and, you know, they wanted you to fix it. And, you know, so naturally, maybe more than that, you know, it was the things I was breaking that was bringing in more things than anything else. But yeah, it naturally kind of grew. And as a result, I found myself spending, like, you know, all day doing tasks on Marlin and not really finding time for anything else. And so at that point I was like, well, I'll try this crowdfunding thing and see if I can get a little help to, you know, make up for the time I'm spending. And I started a Patreon, and that took a long time to build, but once the word kind of got out and some YouTubers and people started talking about it, I did actually pick up enough followers that I could start to do it more full time. And at this point, it's pretty much, it is a full-time job. You know, I get up in the morning, I check the queue, I see what people have submitted in code, and these days it's 4 or 5 new things a day are coming in just in code blobs. And in terms of bug reports, hopefully not bug reports, but, you know, suggestions for improvements are coming in at a similar pace. And so, yeah, it's just it's a very vibrant and busy and very energizing project. And the number of people who know about it, who use it, and or, you know, even if they don't know about the project itself, they bought an inexpensive Chinese printer and came with it. Just the number of people who are becoming more and more familiar with it is just astounding. It's just growing and growing all the time. So it's you know, as we're starting to move into like 32-bit processors and support the new printers that are coming along that have built a little bit of a Marlin for their printer, and we want to sort of incorporate it into the main body, the number of those things that's coming along is just increasing. The number of new peripherals that need to be supported with your firmware is increasing. Things like the Prusa Multi-Material Unit 2.0. Just got supported in Marlin firmware so that you don't have to have a Prusa i3 if you want to use their hardware. And that's kind of the direction we're looking to go going forward. And it's kind of been part of my philosophy the whole way, is just if there's something that some printer out there that uses Marlin or something like Marlin or is Marlin compatible, if it's got hardware that we don't support yet, I want to make it so that not only that printer that is supported, which has that hardware, but then maybe you could take that piece of hardware and bring it over to your, you know, CR10 or your self-built, you know, RepRap or whatever, and just kind of keep that alive, where anything is just a general feature. It's just a piece of hardware, and we want to make it so you can make it work with your machine no matter what. And that's been and not only along those lines, even though the project is very much focused on all this ARM stuff, and you have processors that are at least 6 to 10 times, sometimes even more, as fast as your like AVR ramps boards on your you know, CR10s. Those are coming along now, and even though those are huge and have a lot of memory, we always try to keep in mind that some people only have 128K, and you only got 16 megahertz, and so we have to still make that new feature that, you know, is really cool that someone with 32-bit board could have. If we could make it also work with an 8-bit board, we'll try to do that and make it so everybody can have it at least as closely as possible to what you would get on a 32-bit board. And then, you know, there's definitely that whole frontier of 32-bit opens up the possibility of many smarter, like more complex and like more memory intensive or processor intensive types of features that maybe only will be able to be deployed on a 32-bit board. But at the same time, we want to have it, you know, at least have it somewhere in the same code base. So I don't know, there's a whole lot going on with Marlin that I suppose in the questions we can go over a bit more. We can explore that. But in general, yeah, what's going on right now is, yeah, we built this sort of workshop. We're focusing on Marlin 2.0 release, which I hope to get at least some kind of pre-release or beta out by Murph would be nice. and getting a lot more testing done, being able to play with a lot more machines, things like touch screens, which are hard to get support for. We want to play with those more, and really focus on the 32-bit ARM stuff going forward, especially. All those things are really important to us, and so that's why we've put this place together. And so far, we've been getting an awful lot of support. A lot of people have been popping up, even those who maybe bailed on Patreon because they didn't like certain policies, have found other ways to donate to us, provide us equipment or financial support, and it's helping us go forward. E3D has provided us with their tool changer, which recently tool changing support got added to Marlin, so that's something they want us to explore, and that's also a 32-bit machine, so it gives us an opportunity to play with technology that's really at the forefront of what's being developed, which, you know, that would never happen if it weren't for, in a way, like, you know, just the whole phenomenon of social networking, the existence of YouTube, the ability for us to share in this way and kind of get the word out immediately as to what we need or what's going on, or, you know, what's in our minds even. It's just, I don't know, I just really think that right now it's, this wouldn't be possible before now, to be able to do this in this way and to keep developing the project as kind of like energetically and completely as we're doing right now. If it weren't for the community and just the ability for us to build a community all over the world in this way, it's just, it's been a real boon.
Yeah, the community has reinforced the recognition, thus giving us the reputation of being trustworthy developers, for people to be willing to send us the expensive, you know, machine systems to us to play around with, to tinker, and that's something I'm really appreciative of, and it's great.
Yeah, I don't know if I was doing this in obscurity, something like, you know, you used to have, I mean, open source has been around, and maybe this is something that's just emerged because of the kind of intersection between things like Twitter and GitHub, and being able to create Facebook groups pretty quickly to get the word out and bring communities together. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would have been languishing in obscurity, you know, if we'd been doing this in the days of SourceForge or whatever. But with GitHub and kind of the emergence of social networking, it's made it possible for us to kind of gain a foothold and really move forward and give Marlin kind of a real leg up where it didn't before.
So we got a question from M. Chris. Ooh, just disappeared.
Yeah.
Hold on, still on the mute button. That's actually a question from Tinkers. I guess he heard you bring up the tool changer. So how is the Marlin work with the tool changer going?
Well, so far we're almost done building the tool changer. So once we have it built, we're actually going to use RepRap Firmware on it for a while and see how it functions. We have a panel do display to hook up to it, and I assume that's already supported in there. So we're going to basically get it working. We're going to do test prints. We're going to see how it performs, everything it does, kind of get a sense of how E3D has put together their interface for it. And then I'm going to do the best I can to get Marlin running on the thing, which needs to run on a Do Wi-Fi and a Do X5. So it's a paired up pair of boards, which I know we don't yet support completely. But we do have basic, you know, the support for the processor. And as long as we know what the pins are, we should be able to theoretically get everything working just as it ought to, assuming all the signals are the same, and I assume they are. So it's just a matter of really building a pins file for it, and then getting Marlin running will be pretty straightforward at that point. And then I think after that, we'll start experimenting with the tool changer code that's in there, and we'll see how well it fits with what E3D has envisioned and what RepRap Firmware has put together, and see where we can improve it, see where, you know, and see what we can do with it, basically. Just make it work as well as possible. It's definitely a new platform, so.
Scott, you mentioned you're going to stick with the RRF for a while and, you know, run it on the Duet so you can get used to it and see how they're running it. Is that running off the shelf RepRap firmware, or is it running a custom or a special build that E3D put together or had put together specifically for the tool changer?
It is running a special build. So it may not have all, it may actually have extra code that isn't in the main fork of it at this time. I'm not sure if they've merged it back in yet. They may have, because I know that they're working pretty closely with the author of RepRap Firmware, who's, sorry, his name escapes me at the moment. I should know.
David Crocker?
Yeah, right, totally. And yeah, I was actually, even before this whole thing came along, I was keeping an eye on RepRap Firmware because it was, I know it had seemed quite dormant for a while, but it started to pick up activity over the last couple of years, and it's been interesting to see what's being developed there.
All right. Sorry about that. I had to go take care of some noise upstairs.
All right.
So I missed a couple of questions that were asked. So guys, if you already answered this, just tell me you already did. So Scott, how did you start developing Marlin? Were you with Marlin from the very beginning? You started it, right?
Nope. Actually, Marlin was put together originally as a mashup of Gerbil, which is sort of a CNC driver, a very sort of a general one for driving your steppers and stuff, and then it was mashed up with something that had been in existence for a while called Sprinter, which included the kind of the LCD and menu code that you find in Marlin now, and that was put together originally by Eric van der Zalm. And I want to say a couple other guys, Camille Goebbels, and Eric is at IdeaMaker, and that's why when you first got Marlin, the default config was for an IdeaMaker. I think an IdeaMaker 2 maybe or something. But yeah, he originally put it together around 2011, 2012, so pretty recently celebrated kind of a minor anniversary. And then I don't know exactly when it was tagged or considered to be a 1.0, but it was, by the time I came along, it had been around for a little while. I was sort of, I drifted in around the end of mid 2013, sort of, started playing around and making tweaks. And it was around the mid to end of 2014, like a year later, that I started becoming like sort of the de facto, like I got, you know, commit permissions and started helping others to bring features in, and little by little I took on more of a role of helping others and kind of becoming the incorporator and the facilitator. And open source is kind of built on your capabilities and your reputation. If you don't fly off the handle and get angry a lot, and you're reasonable and you're willing to listen to people's ideas and consider them, and if you're, you know, willing to put in the time and you're capable of addressing things yourself, you generally tend to build a reputation after a while of being, you know, suited for the job, so to speak. You know, and so I kind of little by little took on the role, and you know, along the way I've definitely felt that kind of open source ad hoc weirdness, like imposter syndrome, where like, what am I doing? What is my, you know, what is my role here? And all I know is that when I get up in the morning, I find people asking me questions that I can answer, and people pushing stuff that I can fix. And generally speaking, it seems like something I can do, so I do it. And and so that's kind of how it's sort of happened, is just I'm continuing to do it, and I enjoy it because of all of the, I don't know, just there's so many benefits to it. It's not just, you know, it's a rewarding kind of work, because as soon as you make a change, you're able to experiment with it and get feedback from often dozens, hundreds of people about what your change, how it affected their workflow, or whether good or bad. But you know, you find out very quickly what your changes do, and I'm really enjoying that interaction. And at the same time, I really enjoy working with developers who have ideas and who want to like explore those ideas and try to bring them to it. And I feel bad sometimes when I have to say, well, it doesn't really fit exactly right. I get you what you're trying to do, and it works for you, but it's, we have to think about how that can be generalized, and sometimes I have to say no to things, and I feel bad about that. But at this point, I've become kind of the gauntlet that you have to pass through to get something into Marlin. The first thing that happens is after you submit something to Marlin, it becomes, I get a pass at it, and it becomes unrecognizable and completely loses all of the spirit and soul that you put into it that was yours and unique. And people find that difficult sometimes. But there's a very particular way that that we're kind of putting it together, and there are certain things we're thinking about in a future way, like for the future. And so sometimes I have considerations in mind that people who may be submitting things may not be aware of. And anyway, that's obviously gone far afield from the original question, but in general, yeah, I've taken on this role, and I take it pretty seriously. I've kind of taken on a certain parental ownership of Marlin and protectiveness that, but at the same time, I do want to be open to people who might want to completely revolutionize it. If someone has an idea of how to completely change things, that's cool too.
We had a couple of questions from the chat. One's from Hawk 3D Proto. Their question was, there are other firmwares out there as well. Do you find there's much competition for you, and what is your background?
Right. Competition, well, the one competition is, like, if they've come up with some feature we don't have, and it's really cool, and we don't have it yet, then I want to get it in there. Or I'd like someone to figure it out. And so, things that, or if there's even, and usually it's competition with the state of the art. There's some new, sensor or methodology or algorithm or something that, we can do. And if we haven't got it in there yet, I want to make sure we can get it in there.
What are some of the things off the top of your head that you can think of currently out there that Marlin doesn't have that you're really eager to get right now?
I'd like Marlin to run on MakerBots. That would be great.
Yeah, I can look into that too.
Yeah, I think people would love to replace that. And in general, there's nothing special about the MakerBots except that they have a lot of SPI communication that determines how it behaves. So you just have to know what all those little SPI devices are and how to talk to them. And other than that, it doesn't seem too complex. So that would be one thing. There is, things like the MMU2 was a big challenge, and I'm glad that someone who had an MMU2 had a chance to actually get it working, experiment, and pretty much get it working the way it does in Prusa's firmware. And let's see, so people have actually suggested we have it support SLA and galvanometers, which would be interesting. It's sort of like Delta was kind of bolted on, and SCARA support was sort of bolted on. I think galvanometer would be similar. It would be sort of a bolted on feature, but at the same time, all the other things you would typically want to do, like your Z adjustment while you're printing. I don't know if you'd want to do that with a SLA printer. Maybe you would, but you'd get all the other benefits of it. I think the other part of that question was related to what's my background.
What's your background?
Self-taught coder from the 80s who played with assembly language and BASIC in those days, and now plays with C++ and JavaScript and pretty much whatever language I can kind of pick up. That's my background.
We got a question from Eddie asking, what's your recommendation for a 32-bit board for Marlin 2.0?
Oh, 32-bit boards, there are so many now. The MKSS base, Smoothie board are supported. Various DO-based boards, Ramps FD, and other DO-based boards. There aren't a lot of Teensy-based boards except for like Printer Board out there, but it supports some of those Teensies, and so if people come up with Teensies or STM32 based boards, those are going to be there. but basically all the chips that we're supporting are your DO, which is a SAM 3x80. You've got your NXP LPC 1768 and 1769, which, you know, I mean, they're all ARM-based processors, Cortex-3, Cortex-4 generally, and they're really fast, and we're trying to support them all. And there's even, actually, someone came up with a build where you could build Marlin and run it on Linux with a simulated set of interrupts and things. So you could conceivably run a simulation of Marlin, just building Marlin inside of Linux. So that's something that's being worked on. So yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff there.
Got a question from Filament Frenzy asking, do you know anyone at S3D? If so, can you sprinkle some of your community spirit on them?
I've tried to sprinkle community spirit on a lot of vendors, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes you have to, you know, just forget about them because they won't ever come around. There are certain vendors we could talk about who have been not good to the Marlin license and therefore their users, whether they know it or not. And yeah, in general, yeah, S3D, I think the question with S3D is that people are concerned that they'll come out with a version 5 of their slicer and they'll charge a whole lot for it, even for registered users of 4.0. And, you know, I mean, companies are welcome to make, you know, commercial versions. Nobody really disparages Adobe for making Photoshop, even though there is the GIMP. And we have plenty of options. We have Cura, we have Slick 3R, we have, you know, many other choices. So I feel like the competition is really kind of like they may be pricing themselves out of certain market, but that's their business model. They want to do it that way. So they can accept the consequences of how they go about things. I would really like it if, you know, I like the interface of S3D, Simplified 3D, but I don't mind Cura or Slicer either. They all accomplish the same thing. You just have to, you know, and all of them require some tweaking. So,
Scott, I think the what Filament Frenzy was referring to, and what's the bigger topic with S3D than them charging for the upgrade is actually fixing the features and the functionality that they have now for the customers that have already paid, and not trying to hide behind a smoke screen or fixing problems for one customer. The big one right now is profile importing. You can only import so many profiles before it locks you out.
right.
Their approach has been complete denial on it so far, and they will, if certain users that are vocal enough complain enough, they'll enable it for that user. They'll fix it or something, or reset the back end so that it's re-enabled. But I think it's not the charge or the upgrade fee for 5.0. It's you know, fix what you already promised us that you'd have. And I think that's and actually be transparent about it. I think that's what.
Yeah.
After.
Well, I mean, I don't know what their structure is like. It sounds like they just have a support problem. They don't really have a very good support, and they may not have very good internal communication. And yeah, I don't know much about how they're structured and what their mentality is. My sense is that they just kind of want to put it out there and forget about it, make their sales and move on. And when their next version is ready, they'll just do it, and they don't like to talk about it. They're kind of like Apple in that way. You know, they'll have a support forum so you can cogitate all you want for the months that it takes them to come up with an upgrade, but ultimately they're going to do what they're going to do. So that's the kind of the difference between closed and open source is you can't watch the progress at all. So you just don't know what they're doing. They may be working really hard, and they just don't plan to make a release until Christmas time or whatever. So I don't really know. I just know that as far as the difference between closed and open source, this is definitely one of the pitfalls of, you know, closed source is people could have already fixed this by now if it was open source, and they'd have it working on their copy, you know, and share with their friends. With closed source, we have to wait for them, and that's just annoying. So that's why I've always chosen open source whenever possible. I try to use open source tools, or at the very least, tools that are very supportive and have kind of an open source structure in them, so you can make open source plugins, things like that. I favor much more over closed source stuff whenever possible.
It would be nice to see like the closed source software, like since we're talking about Simplify 3D, you know, see them use a GitHub or a Git to keep, so to speak, change tracking or a live change log of what they're doing. I don't know if there's, I'm not familiar with Git, if it's possible to do that with a closed source system or closed source package or not, but yeah, it'd be awesome to have something like that for closed source software that at least you can see, you know, here's the areas they're working on.
Yeah, I mean, for them, if they want to stay closed source, and I don't begrudge them for it, they should just do much more frequent releases.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Matt, there's private GitHub, there's SourceSafe, there's hundreds of other revisioning and version control that allow them to keep things private and not public to the rest of the world, and still maintain that with their own developer, not sure which.
Yeah.
Right.
Since we were talking about slicers, we're kind of going to jump around here a little bit. We'll get some of the questions from the chat. We'll get some of the questions that were submitted in the last 2 or 3 weeks. But while we're on the topic of slicers, Chris, there was a question from Ben. Oh, there it is. How much time do you spend in slicers? He said it must be a lot of time. And of all the slicers that you work with, which is your favorite out of them, if you can say?
Well, I'm making Lou do all the slicing now.
Yeah.
But no, but seriously, I mean, I do my fair share, and actually, I've been using Simplify 3D mostly because I have it. I figured I should have it, so that's why I got it. If I'm going to be working with Marlin, I definitely ought to have a copy of Simplify 3D. Otherwise, I probably would have stuck with Cura and Slick3R. I think the problem I had with Cura was it was like going through all these strange iterations at a period of time, and with Slick3R, similarly, it was going through a lot of iterations, and I had settled on Simplify 3D because I was starting to use it, and I found that you know, it had better supports, like manual supports control than the others did at that time, and so I just got kind of used to using it. And I haven't been back to Cura and Slick3R nearly enough since that time, but I'd like to play with them more. The thing is that I play with the other end where I'm looking at the code where the G code is coming in. I have to deal with it. So I look at Slick3R or I look at Cura or Simplify whenever it seems like some weird blob of G code is coming through and I want to understand why, or if I want to maybe adapt something. So there was, for example, firmware retraction, where you can use G10 and G11 to do your retraction and recovery instead of letting the slicer do it. Or you can turn on an option where it'll notice that the slicer's trying to do retraction recovery, and it'll take over and do what your G10, G11 settings would have done. And so there was a lot of like back and forth with how slicers output and deal with doing retractions. And sometimes, of course, you've got settings where you're coasting at the end of your move, and then there's a little retraction. And so the types of things that you're using G10, G11 for become somewhat undermined by what you've done in your slicer. And finding those interactions is always interesting. And so sometimes I spend a little time looking at the output of slicers to do that. And whenever I need to print stuff, of course, I use slicers like everyone does and experiment with them and try to figure out what settings work best and how to get rid of the ooze and all that stuff. And I've found pretty much the best settings are whatever settings work, and almost any settings within a certain range work well as long as you're using a very well-constrained, well-put-together machine with a fairly nice, clean, new extruder on it. They always work well at the beginning when they're nice and tight. So it's just keeping things tight seems to work better than almost anything you can do in your slicer. Once you've got everything nicely constrained, you're just tuning things like making sure you get rid of your blobs and things, and trying to get your speeds up maybe sometimes.
Yeah, I think that pros and cons with the different slicing programs. Simplified 3D, if you can afford it, that should be the way to go, since they have all the support and whatnot. Cura is great for people who are starting out and who aren't exactly super savvy with what they're doing, whereas with Slicer, Slicer 3R, if you know what you're doing, you can get into it, and it's all there. It's all up front. Nothing is hidden. And so if you know what you're doing, you can easily just use Slicer. I use Slicer Prusa Edition because it's got the added features that Prusa has implemented. And I find that, you can get away with a lot of things with pretty much any of them if you know what you're doing. They just might be named differently and might be done slightly differently, but overall they're trying to accomplish the same stuff. So if you know your way around, what I recommend is sticking with one and perfect it instead of jumping through the different ones, trying to accomplish something. Because when I started out, I ended up having to download Cura, Rapidier, the slicer itself, and whatnot, just to get something done. But at the end of it, I don't know what I did because I did something differently in each one of them. And so I don't know, I can't really figure out like, what did I do to accomplish this? But if you stick with one and, just keep hammering at it, just refining it, you'll get a better understanding of what exactly is going on. And so you'll understand, how it actually functions instead of just like, oh, this YouTuber is telling me to turn on this feature, set this to that and that.
Yeah. I can agree with that. And Filament Frenzy, Tom in the chat, he's been kind of going through exactly that. He spent the last year using Simplify 3D and tuning profiles that are wildly popular because of the results that he got. For printers like the CR10 and the Ender and stuff like that. And he's got profiles for Prusa's, a bunch of different printers. I'm not sure what all he has, actually. And he did that all with Simplify 3D, but now he's working on switching to Cura. And I'm trying to do the same thing because same deal, kind of like Scott said, I have Simplify 3D. I might as well use it. I bought it for my FlashForge Dreamer, and I might as well use that because I paid for it. And at this point, I've gotten so used to it that I can do things so much faster. And Tom was expressing on Twitter today or yesterday, about making the switch to another slicer. He's basically got to relearn it all again. He's got to retune it because the slicer does things differently. So I can fully respect that.
Yeah.
Sticking with it once you're on it.
Yeah.
Correction, Matt. I believe Tom is migrating or leaning towards IdeaMaker, not Cura.
My mistake. Sorry.
Right.
Yeah. I've been hearing a lot more about IdeaMaker lately. I'll have to try it out.
Yeah, I just downloaded it the other day, actually on Tom and I think Chris's recommendations.
Yeah, for me, I like to stick to the open source stuff, the free stuff. That way, whatever I learn, I can then pass it on, and it's applicable for anyone, to just simply download the free stuff and have access to it. If I figure out how to use Slicer, Simplify 3D, the people who aren't going to pay $150 or however much it costs, they're not going to, this information is useless to them.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, you can say that the principles apply, but your settings don't necessarily migrate perfectly from one to the next. We hope that, that when we have something like, if you say your retraction is this amount, you're probably going to have the same code come out of both slicers. But there are definitely places where the feature's a little fancier. And of course, if you're talking about things where you're talking about generated supports and things, who knows what you get as a result of that. And none of them seem to do everything perfectly. but they're all getting there. They're all evolving, and I definitely agree with the idea of if you're not sure, support the open source alternatives because they're more responsive, and there's a guarantee that you'll probably get that update of that issue that pretty quickly. If not, in the release version that'll come out. Maybe the next release will come out next week, but the patch will probably be in the working version right now. So who knows? It can be worthwhile.
And always using Simplify 3D and Cura parallel to each other, because there was some time last year where Simplify 3D had some weird was creating some weird code, and then lots of people they jumped from Simplify 3D to Cura. So I always kept on using both, because if something is happening with one slicer, I'm not dropped out. I can just switch to the other slicer and kind of create almost the same looking result. And now I'm also trying to get my hands on Slicker, which I've never used. And there was a discussion going on Twitter recently, and somebody's asked if people know a slicer called Ice SL. Have you ever heard about it?
No, it's new to me.
Yeah, you should take a look at it. It's really interesting, but maybe not that easy to learn. But I think you can paint things, and it's not only a slicer, but you can also model it, or you can paint areas that you want to have in a different color. For instance, I think that's quite interesting, but it doesn't seem to be that easy to set up.
I like that idea of the synthesizing of the mixing it together. One of the things that I think has probably been on a lot of people's wish list for a while is something where you manage your objects and your slicing profiles together. So you have, here's my object and here's the 3 slicing profiles I'd like to use with it. And maybe we don't always. Sometimes we only print something once, but there's often times where we just like to have a number of objects that we're going to print periodically. Like we know we're going to probably print that Voronoi skull again, or that that test object, and I just want to have some slicing profiles to go with it, and have those go together and have a nice management system. I would love to have something like that, but so far no one's really put it together. But yeah, I think as these things evolve, there'll certainly be something that becomes like that, and will maybe even be just a host that'll be like, well, what slicer do you like to use? You like slicer? Well, here's your slicer profiles, and if you would like to use Cura, here's your Cura profiles that go with this object. And you want to slice it? Okay, here goes. We'll slice your object with all your latest Cura profiles. And if you change one thing on your Cura profile, it'll reslice all the objects you have associated with that profile, and just do it in the background. And you can pick them up later, on your SD card or whatever.
I've just somebody wants to post the link, because I don't have the right to do it in the private chat here. So
okay, I'll do that. Hey,
Hangout.
Scott, I have a question from the room. Ben Hawk 3D Proto, he's getting ready to go to bed across the pond. It's late night for him, but he wanted to know, do you have a palette from Mosaic Manufacturing? Do you have any thoughts on the palette? I know you're open source guy, they're closed source, but that's a neat.
Yeah, well, I got to see one at the New York Maker Faire over at G Create's lab there. They had one on display that they were just showing off. Mosaic was showing off, and I couldn't stop looking at it. It was just amazing. I think it's super clever, and I was talking to them maybe about it would be neat to have some kind of intercommunication between the firmware and the palette so that they could sync up better. And I haven't followed up on that much, but I mean, I've got a lot going on, so that's possible that something like that could happen. I would be really into facilitating getting the palette and Marlin firmware communicating as well as possible.
How Palette received that idea? Did they seem open to that?
Yeah, the fellow I talked to seemed completely into the idea. Yeah.
So they're doing that. They're doing that now with Octoprint and using Octoprint as the control for the machine. And I've got one of the Palette 2s, and I've been pretty impressed with it. Once you get everything, your machine has to be right first,
Yeah.
and then you have to do a small amount of tuning. But I'm getting some pretty incredible results.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. It probably saves you a lot of filament. Your purge towers probably aren't so big, are they? And yeah, I think it's probably as far as if you're trying to save material, and you do a lot of printing, it's a worthwhile investment. Absolutely.
Scott, back on the moving back over towards firmware, Marlin 2.0. How is adding Ethernet functionality in coming, and what do you guys envision being the final capabilities of that?
Well, there's no Ethernet functionality per se, and there's just the bare beginnings of Wi-Fi support, which treats it like kind of like a serial port. So once you've established a Wi-Fi connection, it works like a host connection does, in the same way, and it's just a streaming connection essentially. But I think that it'd be interesting to explore that more. And what would you have? How would that work? Would you get a terminal, Marlin terminal? And would we have to then author a terminal that runs inside of Marlin firmware, and so on? That says, "Okay, we're ready. Enter next command," and so forth. How do we want to do that? So yeah, that's an interesting question. It's still out there and open. There isn't a lot of boards that support Ethernet. There are a few. And how we support that, I'm not sure yet. How it would expose itself, would it be a host? Do we have an official IEEE port number for doing 3D printing over URL type schemes? How does that work? I'd be actually curious to see anybody who wants to contribute code in that realm. I'd be happy to take it.
A follow-up question to that from Eddie Moser in the chat. With Marlin 2.0 and the possible supporting of 32-bit boards, is there any plans to have HTML5 front end like the Duet boards have?
What, like as an output format?
I think I'm not very familiar with the Duets, Chris. I think you might be.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was replying to a chat. What was the question?
Eddie asked if there's any plans on having an HTML5 front end like the Duets have. You're more familiar with how the Duets front end works.
I think for the built-in web pages that you can navigate to have basic control, start and stop a print, upload your G-code files. Similar to on your tool changer there.
Yeah. Well, again, if somebody decides to for 32-bit boards only, author some kind of host that serves HTTP and does get HTTP requests and handles those, then great. I'd be happy to accept it. But currently there's no particular plan to do that because Marlin is not a host; it's just a firmware.
I think part of the difficulty,
but we've got the space for it on 32-bit boards, so we might as well. We could probably put a whole Linux on there if you really wanted, a full stack.
I think part of the challenge that you're going to have, because you're supporting older, with the air quotes there, 32-bit boards like Smoothie and stuff, versus some of the newer ones like the Duet board. If I'm not mistaken, I believe with the Duet, the web interface itself is actually on the ESP chip.
Yes, it is.
And it's not part of the core firmware, so it's an entirely separate piece, if you will. That's that's just communicating serially back to the firmware, just like an not Ethernet, but it's if
you get the Arduino Wi-Fi 101 library, you can see how it works.
Yeah.
Does it set up its own browser, its own HTTP?
It works kind of like that, yeah. But I mean, it's a general network, though. You could connect it to, you could do Telnet if you wanted to, or you don't have to do HTTP, but you can, and you can do various types of interfaces. Again, we've just started doing support for the 32-bit boards, and we're trying not to put anything in that would basically be unavailable to anybody on AVR right now. But yeah, the sky's the limit with it. With 32-bit boards, again, you could have an entire Linux on the board. You've got so much space, you've got so much RAM, you've got so much processing power. There are a lot of things you could do, but you know, again, this is a lot of code that needs to be written. And people, once you get into, you know, a 32-bit environment with all this space, and you're going to start doing HTTP and TCP/IP and everything, and anything else along those lines, you know, it starts to add up to stuff we can't support on AVR. A very cursory way. So
it also starts to add up. I mean, once you start running a web server and things like that on it,
yeah,
you're running the same is being tethered, so to speak, to your computer. More points of failure or slowdowns in the system now going to
affect security and whatnot too.
Yeah, and we did have a question concerning security. And
did you want on that one?
Sure, pull up a security question. I remember that one.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to look into that myself personally.
Well, yeah,
but just to see.
Well, while I was looking that up, I was really curious. How are you guys? Because I mean, if you're trying to still support AVR for right now and stay in the 8-bit realm, and then kind of move into the 32-bit realm, how are you guys attacking the whole problem of sitting there going, there's obviously going to be development in 32-bit that's going to kind of leave, you know, the 8-bit world behind. How are you guys going to kind of separate that out a little bit?
If you try to enable the feature and compile it on AVR, it'll say you can't do that.
All right, so you're just going to rely on your flagging and tagging and all that stuff. I'm more curious about stopping developers early that sit there and go, no, we just make it all 32-bit and break the 8-bit side of things.
Well, I mean, you know, again, if someone does implement something that requires a really fast processor and lots of RAM, you know, we're going to just have to say you need a really fast processor and lots of RAM. And but everything else is interoperable. I mean, the code itself is still, you know, of a style that you would write if you were doing your typical Arduino sketch, except we're using fast I/O instead of like digital write and pin mode and things like that. Wherever possible, we write directly to the ports, and then for 32-bit, we kind of don't have to do that. So we can kind of get away with, you know, a lot of things in 32-bit realm because we have that extra overhead. But I'm still concerned with, I don't know, I believe that, you know, every electron you save, you know, gives you a brownie point in heaven. So I'm trying to save as many electrons as possible and keep it as efficient as possible, even though it may be running on a 32-bit processor. It's no excuse to start, you know, burning extra electrons if you don't have to.
I was going to say also on that same flag or that same topic, let's say someone, you know, they start out with an 8-bit board and they're working on it and they're playing with the firmware and they decide to go 32-bit. Are you guys kind of setting it up so they literally just change the board and the menu and they've got most of their pre-configuration ready to go? It's going to easily port over, or they're going to have to start over from scratch?
Yeah, I mean, let's say we're starting with Marlin 2.0 running on a ramps board. That's where you'd have the easiest time because you've already ported over your settings. And say you decide to switch to a ramps FD board, you probably can just change the name of the board, and that's it. And that's all you have to do in your configuration. And when you rebuild it, it'll reassign the ports for your functions to whatever the ports are on and pins are on that board, and you're done. As long as you have everything hooked up to, you know, the correct pins, it all should work. The only difference being that oftentimes we're moving from 5-volt logic to 3.3-volt logic, so certain peripherals that worked with your old boards may not work with your new boards. But other than that, all the functionality and behavior is essentially the same, because when you're talking to peripherals, you're using a protocol. It's either serial or SPI or something like that. And so you just have to have your proper SPI implementation for your 32-bit board, and then all the same hardware works just as well.
So you're trying to be really nice about moving us old 8-bit folks over into the 32-bit world without scaring us too much.
Yeah, actually the board that I would recommend mostly would be the rearm, because it actually has 5-volt logic. You just take your existing ramps board for Arduino and you can just put it right on it, and it runs a processor that is an LPC 1768, which is much faster. We're talking 10 or more times faster than your AVR. So you're immediately able to get, much smoother motion. You can go up to 32, 64, interpolation, whatever your stepper drivers can handle. So you get immediate benefits right away, and that means also it'll be quieter and tend to use less energy as well.
I'm gonna interrupt real quick. Kat's gonna step out. Kat, you want to go ahead and tell everybody where to find you?
So thank you that you had me this evening. I just want to say goodbye. I have to go to bed. I'm very tired, and I don't feel so well. I have a little bit of a stomach problem. So I will listen to the rest of the stream tomorrow, and just want to say goodbye. And like always.
Thank you for dropping by.
Yeah, see you.
Good to see you.
Have a good night.
All right, the security question that we were talking about. Tim asked on Twitter, via Twitter, Scott, what do you think about cybersecurity risks of open source? And as a follow-up to that question, what's in place to prevent and crack down on cybersecurity, or just let's go with security risks in general with open source?
Right. Yeah, well, I guess I'd say in one sense, there's a risk that if you download something and it's open source and you only get the binary and you just go ahead and install it, you don't necessarily know that what you're getting is what you're promised or what is even in the source code if it's included with it. You don't know. So I say that the benefit of open source is that you can go back to if you're not sure, you can get the source code that you know is certified to be and checked over. You can compile from that and be guaranteed that you have something that's that's safe and hasn't been meddled with.
Right. The risk there is between you and your connection to the depository, the repository.
Well, yeah, there's always, of course, there's poisoning and so forth. But again, if you have a source code, you know that you're getting it, and if you get it from a trusted source, it's like it's the same as with any type of software, except I would say that when you get closed source software and it's been poisoned, you can't compare it against what you get when you build it, because you can't build it. You can only get the binary. So there's no remedy with closed source software, whereas with open source software, you have the remedy of going to the trusted source.
Yeah, I'd say the risk there is if your connection to GitHub has been hijacked, that's the problem.
It's the same with any
GitHub
software
itself has been hijacked.
Yeah, which again, even if GitHub has been hijacked, I mean, that's a fairly low risk kind of thing. Hijacking and spoofing in between a website and you requires some pretty sophisticated stuff that, I mean, I think the question more goes to what do you do about, like, if somebody comes along and they have malicious intent and they want to put bad code into your software. I mean, everything goes through me, so I would know right away that they were trying to do something weird. Fortunately, with our software, the only things you can do is maybe harm your hardware by causing it to turn on in bad ways or do things that you shouldn't do with your hardware. They're probably not going to steal money out of your bank account or anything like that. But there are definitely some risks with any open source project of people coming in and messing with it. But all the remedies are in place. There's hundreds of people looking at it at any given time. Whereas with closed source software, you just don't know. They have certain processes, but the binaries, once they're out there, if people are downloading them off of torrent sites or whatever and getting the binaries, they don't know if the Photoshop they have is just Photoshop or Photoshop plus a little Trojan that launches alongside it.
Yeah. That
also does nasty things that looked like Photoshop was asking permission to write files, but it's something else. And you've just given it permission. Marlin won't do that. it'll, you've given it permission to move your printer motors and things, but in general, you don't give it permission to access the internet or read or write files. It can't do that anyway. So, with it, it's in a sandbox, but yeah, in other realms, it's definitely a bigger deal than it is with something like firmware, for sure.
What about when you have remote access to your printer?
Well, then it's a problem of Octoprint or the internet or your connection. I mean, I don't think open source has any bearing on it. Whether it's open or closed source, you're still dealing with the same issues. Things the things you can control, you can control. If you don't have source code, then then it's out of your hands. Things that you have source code for, it's somewhat more within your control to do something about it. And that's the essence of what open source is for me. It's like, it just gives me more of an ability to tweak the things I need to tweak. And when it comes to Marlin, there was stuff in there that I didn't like. I would press the wheel and it would chirp at me, and I didn't like the chirping. I had to fix the chirping, so I made it click instead of chirp. And that was the seed. That was what started it all. It was just I need to fix it and make it do what I want and work the way I like. That's just, I think a lot of people are that way, and open source allows us, control freaks to totally do what we want.
Yeah, and when you can see the source codes, you know exactly what's going on.
Yep.
So there shouldn't be any surprises, and if there is, then
hopefully
that should throw up a red flag.
For sure.
One question about Prusa firmware with Marlin. Are they giving back to the Marlin code their changes, or are there a different fork, or what's called?
Yeah, no. Prusa had forked Marlin a while ago. Maybe it was around release candidate 7 or something, and then they have been tailoring it to their particular machine exclusively, and they have not contributed directly back. Although I have borrowed some things from their fork myself and brought them in, as have others have figured out things using their fork as a guide, such as the support for the MMU2 and the support for the laser filament sensor is also pending. That'll be in there shortly. So people have been able to use the source code to figure things out. However, Prusa is not actively working to bring features from their fork back to the main Marlin branch.
Yeah, so you can, if they do something clever, you can use that because they are also open source. So you have to do it yourself then. Yeah.
Yes, we can. They're under our license, so we can. Of course, we're both under the GPL, so we can use their code freely, and they can use our code freely. And their code obviously is somewhat a little stale compared to ours because they're using an older fork. So some of their methodologies may need to be updated. But in essence, there's a lot of one-to-one correspondence, so it's not too hard to bring features over. It just takes some concerted effort and attention, lots of caffeine, and that can sometimes, depending on the feature, it may take days. For example, if I wanted to bring over their farming mode feature, which is probably great for people who have printer farms, it would probably take me something like 3 days to 5 days to port it over and get it tested in the most basic way. And the same goes for just about anything they put in there. It takes some time to bring it over and adapt it. And I'd say that's even true of stuff from other forks of Marlin 1.0 that people have adapted. Some of that stuff may be pretty easy to port over to the version that they made it with, but to bring it over to Marlin 2.0 requires a little more of tweaking because the code's been reorganized and refactored a bit.
Yeah, you said something that reminded me in preparing for the stream and kind of just browsing the Marlin website and things like that. One of the things I did notice, and you kind of pointed it out, is down at the bottom of the Marlin website, it says, with emojis, it says, brought to you with love, lack of sleep, and lots of coffee. Just with that comment, I thought that was the coolest thing. I actually took it over into the questions to remind me to bring it up. And in the chat, if you're in there, Nightbot is posting the link to support Marlin, as well as if you're watching this after the fact, there are links down in the description to everything Marlin. including the Patreon and the GoFundMe for that as well. So help buy Scott some more coffee and Luke some coffee.
Where can we get a Marlin coffee cup?
Well, maybe I'll put this model out there. Right now, it was adapted from. Was this an existing coffee cup model, and then you put the?
No, I made that from scratch.
Yeah, so this
with
is
the
a
Marlin SVG file or DWG file.
Yeah, we're gonna tweak this a little and then put it out.
Actually, I have a better model that's more like a hand-formed mug, but I just been holding off on it.
Yeah, I'm not sure I recommend this one. It took like days to print.
Yeah, yeah. It's oddly, it took forever. I don't know why.
Yeah.
But it came out right. You know, it's the filament switching in between.
Maybe.
It's the thing that took forever.
It is. It's true. The filament switching, the tower, all that. Crazy.
For the more hand model, like ceramic looking mug, I'm thinking about modeling an actual Marlin jumping out of the cup. So maybe I'll have that and just a plain cup.
The handle is a Marlin.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea.
I've done it with dolphins. Why not a Marlin?
I can see somebody poking themselves in the eye, you know, trying to drink out of that.
Yeah, it's strictly ornamental. It's strictly for a decorative purpose.
Yeah, this one we tried to drink out of, and it leaked right away.
Yeah, you can't heat up your liquid too hot.
They call it food safe, but it's really not. If it's not airtight, it's not watertight.
We were you guys were talking about, you know, the safeties in place with open source and the fact that, you know, everyone can see the changes that people make for security reasons. And with the printers, Scott, we were talking about this a little bit before the stream. With the 3D printers and Marlin, it's not so much if somebody puts something nefarious in there, at the least they'll mess with your print quality. The worst they'll do, we were talking, is physical damage and property damage because of things like we saw near and dear to your heart, and I know to Dave as well, with Creality and simply not having the thermal runaway enabled in their CR10s and early printers, as well as, you know, the changes that they did for their the modifications they did for power loss recovery in Marlin. All you got in those cases was a hex file at best from Creality for a while there, and still so with some of their printers. Same way, you know, you go on the Facebook groups and different forums and stuff, and you can download other people's modified firmwares for ANETs, TiVos, you name it, basically any printer that can run Marlin. If all you're getting is a hex file to flash to the AVR chip, you don't know what you're flashing to it. Definitely going to the source is the best place to get it to keep yourself safe, or a vetted copy of it that actually gives you your source code.
Yep, and I mean, we have some of the standard kind of things where, you know, all our zips are given a hash that you can compare and make sure that it matches. And if it doesn't match, then you don't have our hash, our zip file. So you can make sure that you've got the right source. That applies to releases anyway. I don't know if it applies to when you go like just download a random zip file from GitHub, but at least for releases we can be guaranteed. And I think that's probably a good reason to do fairly frequent releases in the open source world too, is just to be able to have those, you know, certified, guaranteed package, you know, IDs on them and stuff. So yeah, there are a lot of ways to kind of deal with security types of issues. The worst thing I could think of is if somebody really figured out a bug in Repetier where if you sent a buffer overflow with malicious code in it, you could get it to give you root access and take over your computer. But hiding that in a firmware would be ridiculous, and getting someone to actually run that in such a way that it caused the problem with the right version of Repetier and so forth, it's just, the gains would not be worth the work amount required to actually get that accomplished. So, you know, yeah, if it doesn't connect to your bank, it's probably not too much it's something you shouldn't worry about too much.
I mean, I think from a security perspective, the software that in the 3D printing community that we'd have to worry about most probably is Octoprint or the OctoPi, because there's so many open source pieces to that. You know, there's the PHP and the lamps or whatever it's using in the background, the web server packages, and you know, everything running behind Octoprint that Gina doesn't have control over.
Yep.
But I mean, again, that goes back to, are you stupid enough to leave it exposed to the internet?
Yeah, and of course, you know, it is web connected, and how you do that is, you know, up to you. But you can figure out ways, use proxies, use VPNs, and you know, do all the things that are required to secure your safety and make sure that people can't gain control over your thermostat and burn down your house.
Yeah, if you have your webcam hooked up to your Octoprint and then have that live streaming, you want to be careful with you know, what you have in view and whatnot. And it's just your run-of-the-mill internet security type of thing where, you know, you don't want certain things exposed and whatnot.
Yep. Yeah. Good old internet. Thanks, internet.
I have one question about the Marlin 2.0. Is that made for 32-bit only, or are we going to get Marlin 2.0 for 8-bit ports?
I didn't quite get the question.
Is it worth 8-bit or only 32?
Oh, it supports everything. Okay. The idea is to make Marlin 2.0 the only version you need, and retire 1.0 completely. Right now, Marlin 2.0 for AVR is much more mature than Marlin 1.9, and it's going to continue to mature. The idea is that it's the same code that runs on the AVR is running on your 32-bit, except through a thin translation layer, which we're calling a hardware access layer, which basically just, you know, gives us an API to deal with things like interrupts and you know, the standard features of these processors, and kind of make them work together. So in Marlin, we generally need timers. We got to turn pins on and off. We need to be able to talk to analog to digital converters and things like that. And as long as we have the ability to do those things in serial communication and all that low-level stuff, everything we've written for the high level, moving the steppers around, it all just works using the same code base. And that was kind of the idea. Was I really there was a lot of talk when we were moving to Marlin too about how we should approach it, whether we should make a whole new fork. And it was generally agreed that to preserve all the stuff we already had in there, it would be best to try and make a translation layer and start with Do, because that was the easiest one, since it already has like our same Arduino H library, and a lot of the interfaces were the same, and so it was easier to do with that one. And then little by little, we've had to fill in the gaps with some of the others, like there weren't necessarily perfect serial or SPI implementations that worked well with, that used the same paradigm that Arduino did. And so we've kind of made everything look like an Arduino to the code, to the high-level code, but you're running on a rearm, or you're running on a smoothie board. So it's kind of cool. It's a little tour de force, a bit of a mess, but at this point, but a messy tour de force.
Yeah, so I could start playing around with Marlin 2.0 on my CR10.
Yeah, it's. I would say the time to start playing around with Marlin 2.0 is now.
Yeah, cool.
And report any bug you have.
Yeah, of course. Don't keep it to yourself. Definitely report that.
While we're on the Marlin 2.0 stuff, let's kind of continue in that direction a little bit. What are some of the biggest features from the changes from Marlin 1 to 2.0 now? What's some of the biggest things we can see coming from 1.19?
Yeah, well, of course, 32-bit support is a big one, probably the most major thing. We've supported, we have a page up, if you go to the Marlin GitHub and you switch over to the bugfix 2 branch, the README on the page shows a little differently. It has a little chart of the different processors that we supported, most of them. and that list should keep growing. But in general, yeah, there's that. Then there are features that are in Marlin 2. Since I basically froze Marlin 1, no new features a couple months ago. So any new features that are coming along are only going to be in Marlin 2. So for example, there's the Prusa MMU2 support. There's the support for filament sensors, but also filament motion sensor. So you can tell if you've got a jam. And responding to that, there's improved handling of power loss recovery, where it doesn't use as much RAM. The version that's in 1.19 was ported from Creality, and it uses a big blob of RAM all the time, so I had to fix that. That's now in Marlin 2. There are, of course, this is more important for people who are maybe working with the code, but it's been reorganized a lot and split up into a lot more files. So we don't have one file that's 15,000 lines long. Now we have 1,000 files that are 15 lines long instead, or well, something between those extremes. We have definitely made the code better. It's easier to find the things you're looking for. If you're using the type of editor I do, I just use one key shortcut and start typing in the file name and hit return when I see the one I like. That makes it easier to find G codes because you can just start typing in the G code and suddenly you've got the file that the G code is in and no other code you have to worry about around it to distract you. So it's kind of really better organized for people who want to customize or do their own stuff. I think it also makes it easier to figure stuff out. Like if you're looking at the code, it makes it easier to sort of make sense of what's happening. But yeah, it's basically just, it's maturing a lot. It's becoming better organized. There's probably some optimizations even for AVR that are in Marlin 2. Certain things have changed, like junction deviation is now the default behavior instead of doing a jerk. So when you do motion, you should get better cornering. And overall, yeah, it's just improved in a bunch of ways that are hard to quantify until you've actually run it. There's also a reorganized menu structure. Another thing, I don't know if it's better, but check it out and see what you think, because maybe certain menu items should be moved around. We'd like to definitely get feedback on that. But one of the things we want to do is definitely improve the UI and do things like first-time setup a lot better, so that you can set your probe distance to the probe from your nozzle with an automated or guided procedure, and you can do all that kind of stuff with with much less having to Google. You can actually do it there. And of course, there's a whole project around trying to do better documentation, which another thing that I hope Lou will be able to help with is for us to put together somewhat more official video and web documentation of the things that you commonly want to understand, like bed leveling and skew. Although we have so many YouTubers doing really good videos that I just want to link to them instead. There's just a lot of really good people out there doing great documentation and coverage that if we did it, it would be dry and boring and clinical, and they do a really nice job of covering it in, and they save us a lot of time. So maybe that's the way to go, is just start recruiting them.
Or maybe it would just index everything that's been done.
Yeah.
And just have like a wiki page.
I have a playlist.
Good sources of things to check out.
Yep.
YouTube tutorials.
Yep. What are some of those creators, if you want to plug some names that come to mind that you're thinking of that do a really good job of explaining Marlin, explaining
Make a Muse, Make Anything.
Yeah, certainly. Chris's Basement is great.
3D printing nerd.
Although, I would say Chris's Basement has been really most on top of the latest stuff. And if I was going to pick anyone to be my right-hand documentation person, it would be Chris. But yeah, there's just a lot of really good stuff, and I've made a playlist on YouTube that I can sometimes share. But you know, that stuff will end up being linked inside of the documentation pages where they're relevant. But the marlinfw.org website is going to continue to get filled out, and that's where that stuff will show up.
Was it 3D Printing Friday or something? Friday? That guy? It was really good.
Yeah, I don't know. There are definitely several I would plug, but
there are lots of great YouTubers, great channels providing a lot of rich content, very helpful stuff.
If somebody wanted to try out Marlin 2.0, what's the easiest way for them to find the latest current version of it?
You know, go to github.com/Marlin Firmware, and it's there's a little drop down on the page where you can select among the branches. You pick bug fix 2.0, and then there's a download. There's a big green button on the right side of the page where you can download a zip. Or if you're into, you know, you want to maybe do mods yourself, you should get yourself a copy of GitHub Desktop and then open it in that, and then basically then you can make mods and submit your changes if you want. But that's the easiest. That's the way to do it, is to go, you know. And I have those links also on the marlinfw.org website.
And didn't Chris do a really good, like, extreme intro to 2.0? I thought I remember him doing a video just to get people moved over.
Yeah, he mentioned some of the coolest new features. Some of the ones I certainly would have pointed out. He mentioned.
I'm more for compiling and stuff like that because it's a little bit different than the 119.
Well, if you're using an AVR, you can still build it with your Arduino. You don't need to do anything differently. You can just follow the same procedure. Open your INO file, hit upload. You know, you may need to. You know, as you move over your settings, you may need to pay a lot more attention because the settings have moved around a little bit. But use your standard text diffing utilities, whatever you like. If you use Notepad++, there's a nice plugin for that for comparing files. And if you've got something like Sublime or I often use GitHub Desktop just to compare configs because it has a nice difference view between files. If you've you know, dropped your new configs onto the default configs, you can instantly see all the differences and stuff like that. There's a few different tools for that, and so I recommend using one of those to move the settings over. But you can compile it for AVR just using Arduino. For 32-bit, some of the 32-bit platforms are supported by the Arduino IDE, like Do, and some of the, I think, I want to say, which other one? There's, I think, Teensy is another one that's supported by Arduino. But we're also encouraging people to use Platform IO as an alternative. And to use that, you actually have to get either Atom or Visual Studio Code. And I'm recommending Visual Studio Code because the support for Atom isn't as good going forward. But Platform IO is a plugin for these editors, which are both free. And then once you have that plugin installed, then you can build for all kinds of platforms. So Marlin has files that are included with it that make it easy to just build. You set up your motherboard and you do what's called an auto build, and it sees your motherboard setting and builds for the right hardware. And Platform IO is nice. It downloads everything you need, all the libraries, all the framework files that you need are all downloaded by it, and it just does the build and does the same thing that Arduino does, just uploads it to the port you've selected. So it just, and it's pretty good at automatically seeing which port you have your printer connected to, so you don't have to even enter that. So but you know, for people who are used to Arduino IDE, you can still use that, although you may have to use 1.9 beta or 1.18 or 1.88, I should say, because 1.88 and 1.9 both fix the issue where it couldn't handle long paths on Windows. So that's all fixed. So just get the latest versions, you should be good.
And then on a shameless to shift topics altogether, I'm curious about because we know, you know, kind of have the history of, you know, working with the Gerbil and all that stuff, and we've been talking about 3D printing. Is Marlin going to start doing some more of the CNC laser alternative style machines? Not just in 3D printing world, but the other styles. Or are you just going to kind of leave that over to Gerbil?
Well, yeah. Well, there are certain features that Marlin has, like it has rudimentary laser and spindle support, and I want to improve that, especially the handling of different PWM speeds or rates. Like the master rate, I think it has right now, it depends on the pin that you're using and what its natural master rate is. But I want to be able to do PWMs at any speed, and for some lasers you need like 25 kilohertz or more as the control signal. So right now we have it so you can either use M3, M4, M5 to control your laser spindle, or you can control the laser with M106, M107, in which case it synchronizes a little bit better with the motion system. That's actually the recommendation right now, is to stick with the M106, 107 method until we get better laser support. But certain other things, like there's different coordinate modes like that you can use when you're in, I should say feed rate modes and stuff that you can use in CNC. Workspace offsets, we've already got support for that through both through G92, and upcoming in the future will be through G10L. There's a lot of stuff out of Linux CNC, if you look at their G code, that we're trying to get better support for. And even things like if you, right now, there are coordinate spaces, or not coordinate spaces, but I want to say orientations. The only place it matters is with M3, or is it G2, G3 arcs, where you do circles or arcs. Right, the original Marlin 1.0 let you do arcs and circles in the XY plane only. Now you can do XZ or YZ arcs, and same is true for Bezier curves. Both of those are now supported. The only caveat is you can't use universal bed leveling right now with either of those, because UBL has a bit of a bug in it in the way that it does motion, so it can't interact with G2, G3, or G5 and do vertical curves. Rather weird thing. But why would you be using bed leveling when you're doing CNC, right? So
you do that
anyway. So a lot of that stuff is coming in, and then there's some work that I did for MakerArm around their SCARA system that I can't bring in now, but in the future, whenever they decide to release their machine and their firmware, I may be able to port that over into Marlin, and that would include a few other features that incorporate both SCARA and CNC stuff. So all of those things are kind of in the margins.
Yeah, we had that same question was also asked from Frederick ahead of time as well.
Oh yeah. So yeah, it's getting there, but it isn't. It is not CNC, and I think its main emphasis is going to always be on 3D printing for sure.
So let's go to some of the pre-submitted questions here real quick. I'd like to go for it.
Sorry, before you do, I've got to take off.
Okay.
So Scott, thanks for joining us tonight. I'll be pinging you offline, and thanks everyone. Support this team there. Click those links.
Good to see you.
Right?
Yeah, you too. If I don't see you prior, we'll see you at Murph.
Oh yeah, I'll be there.
Is Scott gonna be at Murph? The answer is
yeah, I'm gonna be Murph.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna try and bring Lou with me to Murph.
Yep.
And we're gonna go to Murph.
We're gonna drive there.
We're gonna drive all the way from Austin.
Nice.
Yeah. It's worth the trip.
Road trip.
Yeah.
I'll see y'all later. Thanks, everyone.
Aloha.
Yeah, bye.
All right, so let's try to get through some of the pre-submitted questions. The next one I had, changing gears a little bit. So with developing Marlin, you guys obviously have gone through a lot of different printers, testing the different builds of Marlin for certain printers. Colin, Colin, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce your last name. Colin asked, what printers do you own, and what niche features of Marlin do you use on those?
Well, I've got, originally I built myself a Prusa i3 from like self-sourced parts going on eBay, and I learned a lot about that if you want to save money on your printer, buy everything all at once in a single box because you're going to spend a lot on shipping otherwise. But that was my first one, and then I got myself.
The case doesn't necessarily apply these days. Where, you know, when we started out with the Prusa i3, we were sourcing individual parts and everything. It was really very much still in the RepRap, you know, prototyping time where people are still trying to figure out what works best, whether we can use, you know, shower curtain rollers or whatnot.
We were
trying to save like $1 here and there with like sourcing the best bearings and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about early 2013 or so.
Nowadays, everything's already, you know, you can get like really good bearings and whatnot and get impact. And everything is already, there's no, you don't buy a kit and you don't buy parts of a kit. You buy a complete kit and you just put together, and it's 50% pre-assembled already.
Right. So that was my fiddling machine for a while, and I did a lot of messing with it, trying different things, designing different extruders and stuff. Eventually, I wanted just something to have reliable, so I decided I took some of that patron money and got a CR10S, and it turned out to be the most reliable printer I've got out of my arsenal so far. The CR10S, and then I have a second CR10S that was donated by Creality indirectly through Tiny Machine 3D, and recently G-Tech has sent me their A10M and their A20M, and those are, I've been experimenting with the mixing and gradient stuff that and trying to improve what they had done. G-Tech's own firmware had gradient and mixing, and so I've been playing with that. That might be cutting edge, I guess, since very few firmwares have the gradient stuff and are doing mixing. And that is one of the things I really wanted to play with more, was the mixing, because you know, there's so much you know, being done with it, both you know, inexpensive things like the A10, A20, where it's just a dual mixer in a single chamber, and then you've got, you know, Prusa doing their stuff, and you've got yeah, just everybody is sort of experimenting with it in different ways. M3D, is it? I want to say, is it M3D? They've got one that does a CMYK, and it's got a really cool extruder. It's like completely machined and very cleverly made to do the mixing with passively, I guess, and it seems to do a remarkable job. And so I've been experimenting with that a lot and just trying to come up with a nice, simple system to be able to do that and have it work well with slicers. Because if you're going to have something like gradients, you want to also have your purge tower take that into account. And so I've been finagling with that. Now so whereas the G-Tech version doesn't interact nicely with slicers in that way, the version I've made adds one little option where you can treat your gradient like a tool. So if you say T5, it turns on the gradient, and so your slicer will know, oh, you're doing a tool select, so I'll do all the usual stuff. I'll do your purge tower and whatever else it needs to do. And so it'll just fit in with the regular ecosystem that we have. So that's one thing. And then I would say that having the tool changer donated by E3D for our development, that's probably the most cutting edge thing I've had my hands on. I mean, it is a thing of beauty. It's like a machinist's wet dream of, like, you know, just like nice matings and really well put together, very well thought out.
I think it's going to
very sturdy.
Everything we have out of the water.
I just wish it had a giant bed. It's 200. It's a 250 by 200 bed, or is it 300 by 200 bed, which is a great size for many things.
Right.
And it's definitely got a good vertical size. But I feel like, you know, it's got enough room where you could almost just expand it that much more.
I feel it's not so much the size I'm excited about. You know, it's pretty. It's not huge, the print volume compared to what's available out there, especially like, you know, your CR10 and the new Anycubic Chiron, which we just received, and it's huge, gigantic. But this thing, the print quality is gonna be crazy. The E3D tool changer,
Yeah,
its capability is gonna be insane because everything is so rigid. There's hardly any room of any play with it at all. And in the demo video, the guy mentioned that you could put like 4 kilograms onto the printer bed, and it would flex about 0.02 millimeter, which is absurd because it's only held on by one linear rail on one side.
Yeah,
and that's it. And yet,
it's well put together.
It's really tight, and I'm really looking forward to printing on it. If they were doing like 300 millimeter per second print on it in the demo, so
it's fast.
That is insane. That is,
yeah,
that's more than 3 or 4 times faster than 60 millimeters per second.
Yeah. So there you go. I mean, it's got a really light carriage, which makes a big difference. I think that helps a lot.
It'll be really neat to see people take that kit of hardware and, like you guys said, expand it out to a bigger build volume, because the fact that that thing is as solid as it is, you can increase the hardware sticking with the same guts and go out to a CR10 size printer and knock out some huge prints in a short amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
Yep. I mean, it's definitely a good. I mean, I guess when I first heard about it, they mentioned it as a reference platform, and so, but it seems like it may actually be very close to what a final production unit would be like at this point. It's a beta 30, I guess, is the program that I'm under here, which infers that maybe they've done 29 iterations before this one. And it shows. It's definitely well put together beast of a machine. So there's that. Touch screens are another thing that's coming along that I definitely need a chance to play with more. Certainly the Trinamic steppers are a huge thing with their different types of settings. There's a little more emphasis on alternative stepper drivers, like I want to say, is it the PL series drivers? Are another one that aren't getting a lot of attention, but are starting to gain a little bit. Yet another way to get more performance or smoother motion. And so, yeah, there's all the kinds of things that you're hearing about. Those are the sorts of things I want to play with more. And I'm always open to donations of hardware that are on that level. Touch screens, especially right now, are a really big deal. And I have a pile of 32-bit boards, so I don't really need those right now. But yeah, I think it's mainly just being able to wire them into something. So what I want to do is build a machine which is going to be the, basically I can just plug any board into it and use it as a test platform. And then when I'm happy, good, swap in the next board and, just make it easy. So that's something that, I think maybe something might come out of that, because I'm needing to build some kind of universal wiring to connect them together and keep it simple. So maybe in future I'll come up with something that'll make it easier to swap boards from, one printer to the next. It would, and if the industry is listening, I would love it if you guys would make it standard, easier to swap these things in and out, just pluggable. That would be great.
Hey.
Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question from Paul in the room. We're talking about tool changers, and this question seems to fit in that. He said it seems possible to set PID for specific tools, but only a way to set one PID in configuration H. Are PIDs set for each hat end actually respected, and can they be saved to EEPROM?
Let me look at the source code and tell you. Jeez.
Paul, I hope you're still out there, buddy.
Let's see. Last I checked, I don't know.
Paul would ask the most technical, geeky question out of all of us.
Yeah. So yeah. I mean, there is the option to set your, your PID settings and so forth. Let's see. Gosh. I'm not sure what even menu they're set in at this point. I think they're under advanced. Menu advanced. I don't know. I have to look it up. I can tell you that as these things are becoming more common, we're going to have to expand the thing that I'm always loath to add more things to the configurations than is necessary. But I see why you maybe want to have, you know, your hard-coded PID for every tool separate and hard-coded. We just don't provide a facility for that right now because it's based on the idea of a default which you can reset to. And then after that, you know, you're going to do real tuning, and then you're going to save it. The one thing you can do, which I think makes it better, maybe is a better solution in the long term, is to after you've done your PID tuning, do an M503 S0, or you know, which just outputs all your settings, and just save that output. It's output in the form of G code, and then you can take that G code and run it later to get your settings back. And for now, that's, you know, I know that's ugly and interim, but having more and more settings, it's like I want to hide them away somewhere. And it's sort of like the idea of multiple nozzles and multiple tools has been slowly building to become more common. And now it's almost ubiquitous. Like so many of us have multiple tools, or at least multiple extruders now. And so we need these things to be separate. And so it's, you know, it's one of those things that I totally want to definitely account for and do it in a nice way. Does that mean turning all the settings into an array? How do we do it? How do we make it nice where you don't have to have, you know, default PID KP _1, default PID _KP _2, default KP PID _2?
Well, you could be going up to 100 with the conversation I had with Sanjay. He said, you know, this is just, you know, representative of what's possible. He's like, but sure, it's unlimited tool heads and that unlimited capability that he feels is the real sexy part of it. You can have every nozzle size you want, every filament you want, every color you want, and then even different tools, not just additive, but subtractive as well.
Yeah, well, you know, again, there's only so many hours in a day. And the number of submissions that we get in that vein from the thousands of interested people are few and far between, because a lot of people have ideas but don't know how to code. And so, and a lot of people will talk about those ideas for years and years and years and lament how they can't code. And I wish they would learn to code, because they're great. Their ideas are great. If they could code them, they would also exist. And oftentimes, like, I just don't have the time to implement a lot of this stuff. Some of this I can certainly see with the things like the tool changer. Since each of these tools could be conceivably in a completely different tool, a lot would have to change in that vein. And so, how do we do it in a nice way that works well and isn't unwieldy? And you know, in general, a lot of stuff has come around about how do we make the configurations nicer and smaller and stuff. And you know, the thing is that as new features come in, it makes the configs bigger. It's unavoidable, unless two features can be combined into one or something like that, which is rare. You know, they tend to just keep growing and growing and growing. The thing is, we don't want to just keep making more and more files, and in some ways, that would it makes it harder to maintain, especially when we're keeping example configurations. It's better to just have 2 files for each robot than to have 10 files for each robot, or you know, that we have to maintain. And then if one of them gets out of sync, we have to check that one file for all the robots. It just gets very unwieldy. We also have the issue of C++. You can't say, oh, if this file exists, include it. If the file doesn't exist, then it fails. It throws an error. You can't have, if this file doesn't exist, don't include it. Skip that. You have to have the file there. So we're either going to have 2 files for every config, or we're going to have 10 files for every config. They're smaller, but we're going to have all those files for all the configs. There's kind of no way around it. So at this point, we're just going to I think, stick with the 2 files and just you know, keep letting them be long and unwieldy. But we'll try to point out the important parts. And as far as making it easier, configurator tools are certainly the way to go. And I have one about half finished for that's written in JavaScript that can be deployed on the web or on your desktop, and doesn't rely on, you know, Mac, Windows, Linux. It just runs everywhere. And that's sort of what I would like to see completed, something that allows us to just migrate our configs over from one version to another. Maybe points out the important stuff when you're first configuring, and lets you, you know, pick out the features you care about, and then only look at the other settings if those features are relevant. And just kind of keep it hidden as much as possible. But to do that, you know, it requires, again, more time, more effort. And, you know, I think in general, the 2-file thing isn't so bad. Every time I weigh the alternatives, I keep coming back to it as having so many advantages for all of its long ugliness. It's just, it's still better than what all the alternatives are at this point.
Let's stick with the geeky questions. We're going to jump back to the chat again. So Paul asked that question because he, you'll get to see this at Murph, Scott. Paul has a very cool, completely different idea for a tool changer head for 5 tools, or 5 hot end changers. Knack 3D Designs, Carl asked in the chat. He said, he's not great with G code. Is there a command that will let you do microstep the y-axis without affecting recorded position, like many printers allow you to do microstepping or baby stepping the z-axis mid-print?
Sure. Well, you have to enable baby step XY first so that you can baby step XY. And then I believe the code is, I want to say, is it M288, something like that? Or 208, I can't remember which code it is. Let me quickly look it up here, jcode.h. Find baby stepping.
Carl, send Scott coffee now.
Here it is, M290. There you go. So yeah, once you have your baby step XY turned on, you can use M290Y and specify the distance you want to move. And that distance will be moved invisible to the motion system.
So if Carl wanted to, I know what Carl's getting at. If Carl wanted to, he could actually modify the menu structure to change Z-step, micro-stepping or baby stepping to Y-axis instead, and then you won't have to mess with the G-code.
Sure, or with baby step XY, those items will show up in the menu already.
Oh,
you'll have baby step Y, baby step X, baby step Z.
There you go.
Although I don't know why you'd want a baby step Y.
You'll see it, Murph.
Okay. I mean, I can kind of gather in a certain way, but you know, fix your machine.
Yeah, Carl's got it's called the White Knight, I believe. Isn't that right, Chris? The White Knight?
Yep.
Yeah, he's bringing it down to anybody going to Printed Solids meetup next weekend. It's going to be there, along with possibly Paul's 5-tool or 5-head printer as well. As well as then at Murph, if you don't make it to Printed Solid, they'll both, I believe, be at Murph.
Wow.
But that's all I know I'm allowed to say, so I'm going to keep my mouth shut after.
Okay.
Stay quiet, man.
Jeez.
Scott, I'll get you a picture.
I'm not sure I'll be able to make sense of it, but go ahead.
So, hey, another good question in the room. In terms of firmware, what is the difference between multiple tools versus multiple extruders? In some systems, there are a single extruder, but multi-filament.
Yeah. Well, you have things like single nozzle. So there, when you select a tool in single extruder, you're really selecting which extruder is pushing the filament through your single nozzle. And then you have things like mixing extruder. And there you specify a single extruder, so you only have one real extruder, but you specify a certain number of mixing steppers. And so there you might have 3 different steppers pushing the filament in. And that's treated as but then you have the option to say, I want to set a mix, and I want that to be tool number 3. And so when you select a tool with T3, it actually is not selecting a tool, it's just changing the mix. And there are good reasons to use T0 for that because it'll invoke the purge tower in your slicer, for example. So there's that. And then there are some other setups, like there's actually a switching nozzle. And there you have, you may have, as I believe in that case, you usually have one stepper extruding per nozzle, and you're just switching the nozzle up and down with a servo. Usually have one that's one moves lower, and then when you switch the other tool, it moves higher, and then that tool becomes the tool yeah. So, but yeah, it changes depending on the type of stuff you're doing. With dual, if you have a dual independent dual extrusion system, in that case you have the z-axis is shared, the y-axis is shared, but there are two carriages on the x-axis, and each one can move independent of the other. They just can't move past each other. So you can draw the same object either mirrored or in the X, or the same or identical in the X at the same time with those two extruders, which is kind of cool. And in that case, when you select the tool, you may be selecting T0, and then it'll park T1. You select tool 1, it'll park T0. Or you can select like a certain duplication mode where you're doing both at once, and they stay at a certain distance from each other.
Does Marlin support the IDEX systems?
What's that?
Does Marlin have support for IDEX?
Yes. Yeah, it has long-standing support for that. And it's been refined a lot, and it's continuing to improve all the time.
Yeah, MakerGeek's printer, that's all Marlin, IDEX, and Octoprint.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, guys, I'm gonna jump out. I'm getting a little bit tired. So.
All right, Martin, you want to tell everybody where to find you?
Yeah, I'm 3DP Iceland on Twitter, on YouTube, and everywhere. Starting to play around with Twitch as well. So yeah, 3DP Iceland. So I'll see you there. See you at Murph.
There you go.
Excellent. Thank you for coming.
Good night.
Yeah.
Hope things are well in Iceland.
Could you show us what you've got so far?
Yeah, on the model I was working on.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, let me see here. It's actually trying out. It's a Boba Fett model.
Yeah.
Nice. Is this a custom original design, or is this off of like?
Yeah, this model is bought from Gambody. I've got a lot of Star Wars model from that website.
Nice, that's good.
Doing a series of Star Wars characters on my website, on my YouTube channel.
Are you gonna do the whole jetpack and everything?
Yeah, the jetpack is here.
Nice.
It's I put some clear coat on, so it's drying out, so I can't move it at the moment.
Yeah. I like to see 3D printing models get finished.
Yeah,
he's turned into a finishing machine as of late. I mean, he's always done the tiles, but now he's like putting paint on everything. He got an airbrush. It's impressive to watch.
Yeah, it's addictive.
Yeah, no, I don't mind the whatever color or filament. I paint everything.
Excellent. Wow,
Yeah.
that's beautiful.
Do you? How do you prepare your models? Do you sand them first, or glass them, or anything?
Yeah, I put a lot of time on sanding and using filler primer and sanding and more filler priming and sanding, and it's.
How do you get the crevices and whatnot?
Yeah, it's just pain and time. There is no easy fix for that one.
Yeah, I'm always hoping that there's a shortcut somewhere, but
no, not really. It's just pain.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, but see you guys.
Hey,
all right. Good night.
Hey,
Bye.
Quick before
Yeah.
you
I
go.
love Iceland.
Martin's also the host of the European F3D PCH. Martin, do you want to tell everybody what's coming up next week?
Yeah, let me check. I can't remember the, the calendar.
I was going to pull it up and
Yeah. Yeah, the next one is for Cat. Actually, it's 3D printed for jewelry and casting, so SLA and such things. So that will be our next one on the 15th.
Yep, and that's at 3 p.m. Eastern for those of you in the United States, 20 UTC. So With those two, you can figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So see you guys.
Thanks, Martin. Have a good night. Or good
Have a
day.
good one.
Yep. Bye.
Get that coffee.
Did you say good morning or good night?
Good morning for
I-
him.
so-
It's 5 a.m.
Yeah.
All right. So let's get back to the pre-submitted questions. I want to get them in here real quick before we go ahead and do any outros or continue with questions from the chat. The next one, I just screwed it up, was from Greg. He asked, what do you think about hybrid solutions where the PC provides all the computing needs for the head movement and the Arduino receives clocking information that provides step data?
I heard this question earlier.
So my thought on that is, where it's necessary or helpful, it's great. In general, there have been a couple of interesting developments. We have, for example, what's it called? What's the name of the firmware that does it? It's Clipper with a K.
Yeah, Clipper.
Yeah, and that basically breaks down the G code into more direct, like, commands to the steppers. Basically what you would get, what we end up with is blocks in Marlin that are really low level. They take care of everything as far as like telling it how much to accelerate and how long to coast for, and then when to decelerate, and passes on information like how fast the fan should be and things like that to synchronize with it. And what a lot of these systems do now is they'll pre-calculate all that information as if basically stimulating the print the way that, and then producing the output that would just be the blocks. And then those get passed to the printer in a binary form instead of sending G code, which has to go through the whole translation process. It has some good advantages because it requires much less processing. All the data goes straight to the stepper routines and bypasses all that G code parsing that we have to do, and a lot of logic, and maybe it can even do making sure that it's not going outside the bed. All that stuff can be skipped, and so it really can help to optimize the processing. The disadvantage is that if you were going to change the speed of the print or other things, it may be trickier for the firmware to adapt to that, depending on how it's structured. Basically it makes it harder to say, I don't know, I think in general, depending on how it's set up, it probably doesn't infer too many disadvantages, because you could come up with solutions at that level that you would normally try to do at the high level. So if you needed coordinate spaces and have everything be offset by this much when you go to print it, you could probably do that even with this binary format in some way. So in general, it provides some helpful advantages in that the processing is already done on the front end, and so you don't have to do it in the printer. And so the printer can conceivably reach higher speeds and save energy as a result. The disadvantages are, some of the ones I mentioned. It's just a binary format, it's harder to read. If you need to go in and tweak things or add commands in between lines, you might not be able to. So it becomes a little trickier. And with 32-bit processors coming up, and even with AVR, it's somewhat superfluous, because the bottlenecks in Marlin are not necessarily the G code processing itself, but there is some bottleneck in the translation of numbers and the mathematics involved in producing the final moves. So anything that can help reduce that is helpful. And I've considered things like pre-scanning inside Marlin the entire G code, so you could kind of glean some information and maybe do some optimizations. Certainly you could do things like see what the last Z coordinate where it extrudes is, and then maybe what the last layer height is, which normally you don't know. So there are a lot of tricks you could do with the added processing power, and the idea of having blocks at a low level is cool. I just don't know how absolutely necessary it is, especially with machines becoming so much faster. Clipper is cool, and it does what it does well, but it only runs on a BeagleBone Black, and so we're kind of like stuck right now. other systems could work well, and maybe some of those will work, but binary formats aren't necessarily more optimal than ASCII formats, as it turns out. You can represent the number 1 with 1 character in ASCII, but it always takes 4 characters in binary, no matter what. So if you don't need those extra characters, you're wasting space. So binary isn't perfect, but there are a lot of ways you can use it to optimize things. And so some of those tricks are cool, but I think what I would wait for is if there's a standard format, a file format that we can then read and parse and run it, and it's becoming popular, then I would be into bringing support for that into Marlin, like if Clipper files were a thing. I'd love to see them and see whether they can be adapted, because it would probably be a neat optimization. And we could use the infrastructure of Marlin to do the movement without having to use the G-code parser. I think that would be pretty neat. So I'm certainly open to that idea.
All right. Then the next question and final pre-submitted question comes from Bill. Spreadsheet. Yeah. Comes from Bill. He said, how can we, I'm going to kind of sum this up a little bit, and we kind of touched on this, but for developers that are forking Marlin, manufacturers and other developers, how can we prevent or improve features, innovations, and improvements made to Marlin based on firmware by companies and other developers so that they don't get lost or so far away that you now have to reverse engineer what they did to implement it?
Yeah. Well, people often compare open source firmware to a kind of an ecosystem. And in ecosystems, natural selection works in an interesting way, which is that when you have populations that are near to each other and spend a lot of time hanging around each other a lot, they tend to integrate well and they incorporate each other's features. But when they don't integrate and they don't spend a lot of time with each other, like as say Prusa firmware and Marlin firmware, they speciate and they can no longer integrate as easily, and it's harder to form hybrids. But if you are able to form a hybrid, you may not be able to reproduce, but it'll be more robust to disease and more resistant and things. And I think the same is true in open source. I think the analogy holds pretty strongly that it's okay if things diverge a lot. I don't mind that much, because oftentimes they'll develop whole systems that we may not have even conceived of, whereas if they had been working with our firmware, they may have been constrained by the way we do things and have decided to keep it that way. At the same time, I don't begrudge vendors who have a very specific piece of hardware and they kick every part of they rip everything out of Marlin that doesn't pertain to their hardware and make a firmware that is very much unique into itself, and they just keep glomming onto it without ever giving back to Marlin. That doesn't bother me a whole lot, because out of that is going to come something which is better for them. It's the whole point of open source in the first place. There is nothing in the GPL that requires people to give back to the original project. It's something that is possible, and it's something that we like to take advantage of when it makes sense. But I don't mind the fact that there are innovations happening and that they may diverge a lot, because that actually does produce some really interesting variation and diversity, and that can be very helpful later on when we try to figure out things. They may have solved a problem in their own ecosystem that, because of the other things that fed into it, were easier for them to do than if they had tried to do it with ours. And so, there's a lot of I think it's just a natural part of open source that things do diverge, and that you can't enforce that people have to put it back in, and there's no real reason to, because everyone's going to take on their own style. Open source, conversely, a lot of people have an understanding like they think it should all be free and so forth, but GPL specifically is there to foster and encourage the creation of companies around it, around projects. and to allow economic activity to develop around these things, because economic activity is a natural outgrowth of, you know, human interaction and creativity. So there's nothing in the GPL that stands in the way. There are non-commercial licenses, but Marlin opted not to go for those for various reasons. One of the biggest being that IdeaMaker was closely involved with its initial development. So, you know, it's just, it's a really good license. And I think that overall open source and GPL in particular is, you know, it's there to keep everything out there so that we can cherry pick, we can pull from them, but there are no rules. You know, you can diverge, you can fork, you can mess around with it. The only rules are you have to stick with the license, and you know, if you do produce a binary and start selling it or giving it away, include the source code, because that's, you know, that's a condition of using it. That's the only thing we ask, is just make sure your customers get the source code, because, you know, we promised them that they would. ANET. You know, if you're not giving them their source, you're not. It's we could give two flying things for what you do with, you know, our source, but as soon as you start producing binaries and giving it to customers, you know, you owe those customers there's the source we promised. And so it comes down to, you know, it's their interest that mostly I'm interested in protecting, not you know, ours. As far as those go, we can bring stuff back in once we have it in our hands, we understand it. We can even figure out, you know, if somebody has closed source, if ANET has really cool features and they've never opened them up, we'll figure it out. We'll make it work. We'll get it out there and we'll get it working. But it's just more effort for us. And at the same time, it's like, you know, unfortunately, customers who want those features and they want to rebuild Marlin and maybe tweak a few other things, they won't be able to. And that's one of the disadvantages that comes from people who mess with our licenses. They'll, you know, they don't give the customers all the good stuff that we promised they'd get. And yeah, we want to keep that. We want to keep that happening.
Gotcha. You know, that was that was an interesting moment last year at ERF. You were up on the stage, getting ready to give your talk, and Jack Chen and two other Creality folks. I can't remember the other guy's name, but the woman was the face of Creality, the one making the videos. When you were up there on the stage, did you know who that was walking into the front row at that point? Because based on what you were saying, I think you might have known.
Yes.
Step on some toes? Or
Well, yeah, no, at the time, there was a lot of, like, you know, kerfuffle about Creality, like having difficulty with sharing the source of Marlin that they were using and with their customers. And it took them quite some time to really finally get the software out on their website. And they were kind of mum. They weren't very communicative about it. I actually have I'm connected with Jack on Facebook and I've chatted with him occasionally, but, you know, not much of substance passes between us. So I haven't really gotten any info on that, and I hadn't at the time. And there have been periods when there have been, you know, the rumor mill came back to me that they were just planning not to ever release it at one point, and that turned out not to be true. But it was like this weird circular thing where Naomi Wu said something to someone who misunderstood it, and then it got back to me, and then it got to Naomi that this was being said, and that I had no idea it had come from her. And it was funny because, like, it was just, hey, wait a minute, that came from you, this whole misunderstanding, because of the way you phrase something, and it could be taken 2 or 3 different ways. But I think it was something along the lines of, you know, if the community doesn't stop being annoying, then, you know, maybe they'll never release the firmware. And I think someone took it as they're never going to release the firmware, full stop. Of course, the thing was they were just taking their time and trying to get it out there and maybe even do it right. And they finally did produce a nice page that does have all the firmwares. And as far as I know, they are the ones that correspond to what you get when you buy your machine. And but I would prefer that they had a GitHub and had all their stuff there. Gtech, for example, when they released their A10M and A20M, initially I was like, okay, let's see how these guys are behaving, because they're cheap and they're probably awful too. But then it turned out that they had a GitHub and I could edit their firmware, and they took my submissions and actually put them out to customers, and I was astounded. I don't know what their initial. A lot of people had an issue with them, but they seem to be really trying to do better. And I think that overall, all those kinds of all this talk about intellectual property and especially copyright protection and the world of open source has been educational for companies in China and elsewhere who aren't necessarily that familiar with the way that we view IP rights and copyright. And copyright in particular seems to be a real sticking point, because there's nothing compelling that says that is forcing ANET's hand, and so they just don't. But I've tried doing DMCA takedowns and had moderate success. So actually, it turns out that if you go to Amazon and you say, "Hey, this company, ANET or whatever, is doing this, and they're using our property and they're not honoring our license," Amazon will actually take that seriously, and they'll pull it down. They'll pull their products. And that's how I did that as an experiment with a particular machine, which I won't mention, and it did get pulled from the store. So that's an effective tool that we can use if vendors are completely unresponsive. And I would prefer that they all get real woke and decide to adopt the open source way, but that's not the culture from the top down. And really, they're just looking at it. They're looking at profit and competition and protection and the kind of ways that businesses think.
Yeah.
And I've gotten it from Western companies too. That they would like to. Yeah, I would like to use Marlin now, but later it would be great if maybe we could hire you to do a closed source firmware. And I'd be like, I'm not the guy, because I have too much. I'm poison. I've been way too much contact with open source firmware to ever do a closed source firmware.
A conflict of interest where,
yes,
if you're going to develop anything proprietary and you want to adapt that feature to the open source, then what you do is you spend months on this at their expense.
Right. Answering their questions.
You're still working towards the same development.
Yeah, I couldn't work on it at all.
Right. Yeah, that's the thing. So
I would not be able to, because my presence would be enough to be like, you've seen the source code, therefore the algorithms. You can't do that. All you can do is all people can do is look at the interface and the way it behaves, and that's what you're allowed to look at.
Right.
And if I were to be there at all, it would be poison. They would be sued into oblivion. So that's one of the disadvantages of open source. If you work on open source projects, you may not be able to do closed source work in the future in the same realm.
Right.
Which is, to me, it's fine. I don't mind that, because I'm an open source. Really, that's what I live for. So I don't care.
But you'll totally be open to a paid sponsor feature where like Creality or whatever has an idea of a feature they want implemented. They want to hire you to add it to the open source.
Well, that's different. That's different.
Right.
They would have to release that because it's part of the open source firmware. When they put out their machine, that would be given to the public. So that's different. But yeah, I mean, again, if someone were to hire me for something closed source, it would have to be in a different realm altogether, ultimately, because I just have too much poison from Marlin, and that's just it's one of the hazards. But again, I don't mind. I work on software all the time in different ways and work in different realms. So.
If somebody or some manufacturer wanted a specific feature, like Lou said, you would be open to the idea of being hired to include that into the open source, like to develop a feature for them.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just saying if anybody has the money and wants a certain feature, there you go. That's how you get Scott to put it in.
Right. Yeah. My initial reference was to the idea of I could not write a closed source firmware. I could maybe, I may be able to add a feature to a closed source firmware as long as it's not, completely copying an open source version of that, which already exists in Marlin. If it was something new and unique, I could do it. It would be fine.
Chris asked, we were talking about companies being compliant with Marlin development that are using Marlin and supporting Marlin. He asked if Creality is still supporting Marlin development.
Actually, yeah, Creality supports Marlin development monetarily with a monthly donation to Patreon in the amount of $300, just for full disclosure. And I'm still, if they pull any crap, I'm still going to be critical. And if they decide to pull their donation, that's fine. But so far they've been great, and my communication with them has actually been very beneficial for both of us. And they did invite me to come to TCT show, but unfortunately I was too shy to go, so I did not go to TCT show. But I would love to do that in the future, but the thing is, I'm not in this to go out and schmooze and go to TCT show unless I can bring something of value. I would definitely love to educate China about open source, so I would definitely accept that kind of invitation in the future if they want to.
You could take them, Dave.
Yeah. Well, frankly, yes, you can keep them. Yeah.
I want to quickly point out that Creality has released all of the sources.
Yeah.
So to anyone that's isn't aware of that, so props to them for having released all of their codes.
Right. There was some strange back and forth where it seemed like what they were looking for, which was rather strange, was there was the question of the open source hardware certification that they got for the Ender 3. And of course, I never talked to them or insisted or had anything to do with maybe with saying that they should or shouldn't or ought to do anything in terms of open source hardware. I think that's great if they do, but there was some sense that in the air that they were looking to see some kind of material and maybe immediate reward for that, either in the form of lots of positive feedback from YouTubers or a jump in sales that they could see on their chart next to the date that they released their OSHWA certification or something along those lines. And I think maybe, it's not, I don't want to say it's just a purely idealistic thing, like there shouldn't be, like they shouldn't expect any result, and that if they did it, they should have done it purely for its own benefit. Like, isn't it awesome? We're going to do the open source because we believe in open source. Maybe, if you look at someone like Lulzbot, LF Objects, they're very much ideologically associated with open source. They don't even use open source, closed source software, for their internal work that they do. If they can have an open source version of something like a browser or whatever, they'll use that instead. And that's just part of their culture. And that hasn't migrated to most of China, but there are some people, some of whom are Western educated or have had some association with open source projects in the past, or who are just feeling more modern or attracted to more modernity, that are more into the open source ethos and kind of appreciate it for its own sake and also for the benefits that it brings to the innovation space. Because we talk about open source a lot and how it's nice to be able to get the firmware and build it and make your mods to it and all the freedoms that come with it. But it also, it does tend to accelerate innovation. The companies like Creality would have a real hard time existing if it weren't for Marlin and open source firmware in general.
There's a question now. Would you be open to developing something with a gag order that's held a feature for being released for a period of time?
The gag order. Somebody has heard something. Actually, that's been proposed. Could I provide some feature which you know, again, I'm bound by the license as much as anybody. I'm just a contributor to Marlin, even though I'm the contributor who also is like, you know, the one who says you need to put this many spaces between your commas. Like like I have no right to say you can keep the source closed. If you have put something in Marlin and then you've released that software to the public, you must on day one provide that source code. So I cannot sign a gag order legally, and I wouldn't sign a gag order legally to that effect, because I would be violating Marlin's license and my own ethics in that sense too. How you like that?
We're not basement dwellers.
That's right.
Yeah, I saw that.
That's true. We have a second floor, and yeah, you know, you have to actually work to get up here.
I am in the basement.
Me too.
This is a dry wall, right? We have neighbors on the other side of this wall, right?
Yep.
So, hey, another one of the pre-submitted questions, is it possible to add live infill and layer height adjustment to firmware? And the other question was, how can one submit support for unsupported languages?
Yeah. On the first question, that's kind of the realm of the slicer. What the firmware is really meant to obediently move the steppers and so forth where it's supposed to move, keep the temperatures where they're supposed to be, and be an obedient servant to the host or to the G-code. So there tries to do a few clever things, but I'm always a little dubious about adding too much cleverness. Even firmware retraction is like sometimes feels like a bridge too far. So, you know, infill and stuff is actually a concept which is so high level that you'd need a 32-bit board and basically a slicer running inside on that board alongside the firmware to be able to modify the infill or to do anything with it. But I do like this concept where you might be able to like hand it just like a 2D SVG outline of the thing you wanted to make for that one layer, and then you just slice the one layer. Like that would be kind of cool. I could see the firmware doing that on a 32-bit system, and then you could modify the walls and the infill all as you wished. And you might even be able to get it to generate supports by doing a pre-scan. But all that's going to require 32 bits and a lot of RAM. So that's really where the main problem comes in, is it's just a big challenge to get firmware to do something that right now the slicer does all the good work on.
And then the other question, that actually, so the question I had asked about keeping features into Marlin, added into Marlin, so that we don't have to reverse engineer things.
Yeah.
That was actually from 3D Gusner. My mistake on the names, I got them mixed up.
Oh, okay.
The question about the live infill and layer height, that was from Bill.
Right.
And then the last question, pre-submitted question that we had was, I apologize, I'm not even attempting that name. But it said, hello, I'm from India. I would like to build my own language.
Right.
Language support for, it's Canada.
Right.
Is widely used in Karnataka.
Right.
If you would guide me on how to do that, it would greatly help.
Well, it's a little involved, but yeah, Marlin includes a script that allows you to convert BDF files to a format that the UHG library likes. And so you can actually take the font you need and bring it in, and then you use another script to find all the UTF-8 characters that you used in the font, and then it'll strip out all the ones that you're not using. And so you can have a nice optimized font and language all at the same time, but you do have to run it through a script that's included in the build root folder with Marlin. So that's the short answer. The longer answer is, contact me on GitHub and look on the marlinfirmware.org website for a little more guidance in font stuff. I'll be right back. I have to take a quick run to the other room and grab some water. Be right back. Let me entertain you.
I'm still here.
We didn't get to kind of hear about you and how you got involved with Marlin and doing the hardware testing. for Scott. So do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became associated with Marlin?
Well, when Scott has moved out to Seattle back in, I want to say 2015 or so, I later moved out to Seattle as well and crashed on his couch for some time. And together we started building our first printer with Prusa i3. And that's when we had to source everything ourselves and try to figure out the best bearing to use and whatnot. But then we built that printer, and then we got started on a Delta bot, which we never got around to finishing. But then I left Seattle after my contract work had ended in Seattle. And I went on the road for like 4 years, just traveling throughout the United States, cycling throughout the United States, and also I sailed a little bit up and down the western coast of the United States. So I kind of got out of it for a bit, but I was still freelancing, doing web work and web development and whatnot. And that's how we got to know each other, actually. We worked together for this contractor in Holyoke, Massachusetts. And
web development.
Yeah, at the time, Scott was doing the web development side, and I was doing the graphic design side for most of our projects together. But later on, when I was living in Seattle, I was just being a webmaster, general IT support guy for this company. And that was going great, but then it ended, and I moved back to Massachusetts, and then I started cycling across country. So,
and therein lies a tale.
Yeah, and then I was living in Seattle, and then I was living in Seattle and San Diego and Texas and all over the place. But long story short, I was back in Massachusetts, working for this company, being their webmaster, print guy, office manager, grossly underpaid. And Scott hit me up like, hey, I could use someone to help me shoot videos and do support and further develop Marlin. And I just jumped at it because I was very dissatisfied with where I was at. It was just supposed to be a temporary thing for me. I was hoping to get paid decently to save up to continue my travel, but I ended up getting a very low-paying job at high caliber. Basically, I was...
You know how these things go.
Yeah, I wasn't paid enough for what I was doing. I was doing these guys like everything, IT support, web. I was the office manager.
You were the geek.
Yeah, I was the database guy and everything.
Congratulations.
And so yeah, when Scott offered me the gig, I was like, yeah, let's do it. So I moved down from Massachusetts. I drove down from Massachusetts to Austin, Texas, and then we got a place together. And I've been busy ever since, just putting this place together. And hopefully, I will become more acquainted with the code side of Marlin. I've done, dabble in it a little bit, but I'm not super familiar with it and comfortable with it, where I can just add features and bug fix and handle all the pull requests and push requests. But hopefully, eventually, in the next couple months, I'll get to that point and I'll be able to handle a lot of that.
Hopefully.
So yeah,
take a load off.
Yeah, no, that is the goal. Not hopefully, that will happen. And we'll take the load off of you, so then you can focus on working on all the new features where, and I'll be helping out people.
Yeah, it's always something to do. I've definitely no shortage of tasks on the task list. That's for sure. It is endless.
Yeah, and not just on the side of the coding, but also day to day and everything.
And of course, as you probably all know, the documentation is wanting. So there's plenty to do there. That's for sure.
So when you guys are testing features or testing code changes in Marlin, who gets blamed when something goes wrong? Is it Lou's fault that he's doing something wrong with the printer, or is it?
It's always my fault. It's always my fault, no matter what. If somebody puts a code change in and it's got a bug in it and I let it in, that's my fault. If I wrote it and it's got a bug, I'm sure that's my fault too. Yeah, ultimately the buck stops with me because I'm the main gauntlet of what gets in right now. So, and I'm dearth to like allow other people to have too many. Like if you have too many people with commit privileges, it becomes a bit messy and everyone's chasing after each other a little bit. And I'm the kind of person, if I don't see the right number of spaces, I'm like, I can't sleep. Your spacing is wrong. But you know, and in general, yeah, there's so much to do that it's like from day to day I forget like what I did yesterday. I'm on to the next feature and somebody comes and reminds me, oh yeah, you did this and there's a bug. I'm always grateful. So someone came along later and paid attention and actually found the bug. So that's nice.
Yeah, and in addition to the development, improving on Marlin, is that we have to constantly promote ourselves, and so we're also fixated on putting out content, making trying to gain exposure for ourselves, so then we can get support for it and continue the work. And so that's something that takes up our time and takes us away from the actual work that's needed.
Well, you remember there was a long. I mean, in general, I wanted to not do that.
Right. Yeah.
My YouTube channel. If I was going to put something on there about anything, it would need to be somewhat relevant.
Mm-hmm.
I did one video on like the what was it? The matrix displays, the little LPC 1768 matrix displays, which are did I just say LPC 17? Max 7729, I guess, or Max 7129, Max 7219. Okay, that's it. The MAX 7219 matrix displays, which also come in the form of segmented numerical displays, are supported in Marlin, and it's one of those obscure things that you would never really use that often unless you were really into debugging or wanted some kind of cool display on your printer. It shows you things like the depth of your planner buffer and how many moves there are and stuff like that, and low-level stuff that would be hard to display as text or print out to the console, but you can display it really quickly in a matrix. And I really just wanted to practice, like, let's make a nice informative video that's documentation that covers a single topic and just keep it as concise as possible. And that may be 5 minutes long, and it took me a whole day. Yeah. So after that, I was like, I definitely need someone to help with this because I can't spend a whole day on some small thing if I'm going to actually get anything done in the issue queue today. So it's like, yeah, it's definitely, there's a lot of shared labor. But again, the nature of open source is such that, I can recruit Lou, who's, 2 feet away, and then I can recruit someone on the opposite side of the planet, who maybe puts in, 5 hours a month, and yet, all these people can work together and collaborate really well. So, it's just a matter of finding the right talent and people with the right kind of interest and, a little bit of a passion about this whole technology. There's so much, 3D printing is, you don't even necessarily have to be passionate about it to find it cool, but once you get into it and you start playing around with it and you realize all the challenges that still exist in the space, engineering wise, if you're at all like a geek or an engineer, it just, you just can find an endless number of things to work on. It's just always interesting.
Yeah. And yeah, like every aspect of it takes time out of the actual work itself. Just like,
Right.
Being a part of the community, joining in the live streams and whatnot, trying to be helpful.
You realize you guys are undermining Marlin development right at this moment.
Right, but it's a part of it. That's the beauty of it, is that, we can provide direct support, and that's what people love about it, part of it, and, also work on it. But every everything, every aspect takes time out of it. And so that's something that we're constantly juggling between. And it's a constant a struggle, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I think if you've seen the interview with Gina that Tom did, she talks about the same thing. It's just, if you're doing a project on your own and you're supported by the community, that's great. But then you're left with like all this unstructured time, and you have to really learn how to put it together, how to manage that time and use it as best as possible. And with the way that things are, like as I mentioned, I get like 5 contributions a day these days of just code changes. And so the first thing I'll do every day is take care of those as much as possible, do the cleanup on those. And I feel like if I get a few of those in every week, you know, it's progressing, because those things address real issues or interests that people have in features that they feel like they should have or are missing. And so, you know, even if I spend a few hours on that, I feel like I'm at least meeting that much. And then if we can, you know, and so then it just comes down to making sure to do that within that amount of space. And then, okay, the next thing we're going to do is have lunch, and then we're going to do the documentation part. And kind of like structuring it. And that has been a challenge for me. And I think that, you know, we just need to work on that kind of structure more.
Yeah, like you can spend all of your time in the GitHub issues, with the GitHub issues, or on YouTube answering questions, or on Reddit answering questions, or Facebook answering questions. You can spend all your time on any of those platforms, and you're doing, you know, providing a great service to a lot of people. But at the end of the day, it doesn't help move the, you know, the program, and it just eats away at your time.
Yeah, we're learning to see them as tools. I look at, you know, I mean, it's been it's sort of like anything. The reason I created the Twitter Marlin Firmware was, and still is, to get information out about what's being developed and kind of like keep people in the loop, so that they get a sense that there is progress being made and that development is happening and there's something of interest going on, and sort of, you know, also let them know that, you know, hey, that feature you like on your Prusa MK3, yeah, guess what? You can get it now on your, you know, your CR10 or whatever.
I think it's important.
You know, just let them know that there's stuff
being heard.
Yeah, well, yeah, that and you know, that is, again, that's the thing, is to give them outlets and to keep that back and forth, because for a while, and like anything, GitHub is just another corner of the internet that nobody visits unless you're really a geek. And, you know, I'm not interested in necessarily getting people to come on over to GitHub and get them hits and get them revenue, but because hey, it's Microsoft, they don't need it. But I like people who maybe are into making, or maybe a bit of a coder. I'd like them to know that they can contribute. I'd like people who maybe, you know, if they're a user and they're trying out some other firmware, you know, that, you know, there's something in our firmware that might want to try, or that they should ask their firmware guy about. You know, it's kind of like keep that information out there and just keep it known that there is a real community around it. And I think that that's been part of what's helped to keep the momentum of Marlin going over the time, is just starting to bring more community involvement and keep that dialogue going. Because I get so many interesting ideas that I think are like crazy, but then after a couple of days, they start to make sense. Like, you know, actually that's kind of a good idea. Maybe I should do that. You know, which at first I balk at, but you know, that's how it works sometimes. You know, you need to have those extra inlets, because otherwise you become too insular, and you won't even, that spark won't hit you, you know.
Or simply seeing it and trying. You know.
Yeah, for sure. Anyway, does that answer the question? Was there a question?
What was the question?
Yeah, I'm kind of like, I forgot what the question was now. I think it was who gets in trouble when something breaks.
Oh, yes.
Well, I think we covered.
Yeah.
It's everyone's fault.
It's Lou.
We're spreading around. That's
why I got him. It's his fault now.
There you go.
I'll take the blame.
Sherry Smith. Now we're starting to get the EU side of it.
Yes, we are single. Thank you for asking.
Single extruders.
Sherry asked how this is totally up to you guys. Any of these questions, if you don't want to answer a question, that's fine. But how is the Patreon money divided amongst all the Marlin developers?
Right. Well, Patreon money is not divided amongst all the Marlin developers.
Yeah.
The Patreon money
works.
is that's me begging because I can't afford to both work a full-time job and do Marlin development. So I kind of like I did the Patreon campaign as an experiment to see if it would end up keeping me from starving, and at this point it has. What I've been able to do is pay the rent and occasionally buy equipment and, of course, food and coffee. Very important. And then when there was a period of time when I finally reached the level where I could start to give out rewards. So there were, I put out some bounties for certain features. There was one issue which was driving me insane, where we couldn't find the layer shifting between Marlin 1.1.8 and 1.1.9 release. There was just this layer shifting issue that was driving me nuts. And so I was able to finally, the level reached a point where I could start offering bounties. And so I put out a bounty, and I got a lot of hits as a result. This guy in Argentina who was really savvy came along and just like whipped together, you know, just like went to town and just went through all this testing and analysis and really figured out a very comprehensive solution. Essentially rewrote a whole section of the stepper code and just like did all this work, and I was happy to send him the bounty, and I would love to be able to do that more. Unfortunately, due to the Patreon boycott, I lost about 40% of my revenue just in the last 2 months due to Argon of Assad, was that his name? Sargon of Akkad? Sargon of Akkad.
Sargon, yeah.
For people who felt a great solidarity with Sargon, unfortunately left Patreon and so didn't find another way to replace their revenue. So I started offering other alternatives to Patreon after that, because I realized it was very fickle and brittle. If you know, Patreon's community guidelines are what they are, and they police them the way they want to. And I don't know what that's about or how it works, but they have their own vision. And but for me, Patreon has been really valuable, and it's been a great tool. And it's kind of the best way I have to keep the community connection in a very direct way. I can provide stuff only for the patrons and so forth. And so that's been really useful. But I understand that people have their view of what Patreon is as a business model, and maybe they think it's politically trying to be very weird, so they want to escape. And so I've tried to give them alternatives. I've got like buy me a coffee. Even a coffee helps. But yeah, so essentially, to answer the question, the revenue is divided. It comes to me as the lead developer, and I distribute it to those who provide some features that I can afford to pay bounties for, and I occasionally buy equipment with it. But for the most part, it's covering just my general expenses as I work day to day on Marlin, and not much else.
Yeah, to quickly answer that one, basically Patreon. The money that goes to Patreon, it doesn't, you know, Patreon isn't one encompassing thing. Patreon is, if you set up an account on Patreon, and anyone contributing to that account, it goes to that account. It doesn't go to all the other people who have Patreon accounts.
Well, again, yeah, no, it comes to me.
Yeah, right. So again, in this case, the donate to Patreon through thinkyhead.com goes to Scott, and you know. That's pretty much it. If anyone else that is a curator or developer of Marlin and they set up their own Patreon thing and you contribute to them, it goes to them. It doesn't go to anyone else. It doesn't go to a whole party of Marlin developers. It's just
right.
Whoever that set up that Patreon.
Right. So it was never my intent to like set up a Patreon and say, I am Marlin Firmware, and if you donate to me, you are donating to Marlin. And I know it's been phrased that way a lot. And in essence, in some sense, it is true, because you know, I do work on Marlin on a daily basis. I'm the person who integrates the code that's contributed into Marlin. I'm responsible for doing releases, writing up release notes, doing a lot of the documentation, and so on. So, you know, what you're contributing to is a guy who works a lot on Marlin, essentially, and is like now considered the lead developer in a kind of an open source de facto ad hoc kind of way that this happens. You just fall into this position. Linus Torvalds.
It also goes towards the guy helps the guy.
Yeah, and it helps Lou as well. I wouldn't be able to pay Lou's rent and have him help me with the video stuff and other things that we need if it weren't for the donations coming in. But that's the reason we got this
part-time job on the side too.
Yeah, he's got a part-time. But yeah, so essentially, I was living in this place and renting a room for $600 while working for MakerArm, and I was able to, thanks to the salary from MakerArm, to save up a bit as well. And when that ended, and MakerArm is in restructuring at the moment, it was time to. I knew I wanted to move either out of Austin or to a cooler part of Austin, because where I was living there was no life. It was all about working on Marlin, and then I would, you know, wake up and there was no life. That's why, you know, I came to Austin. I figured there's cool stuff in Austin. I know there is. I just happened to be in the wrong part. So I moved further south to this fine apartment, and it's essentially 100% a workshop for working on Marlin and 3D printing and testing and the stuff that we're doing. And it's just it's kind of our life goal right now, is to just continue to work on Marlin, push it forward, and to keep testing it. And you know, it is an open source project, and it's very interesting how open source itself facilitates this kind of you know, project. I never thought in a million years I'd be working full time on it. I thought I'd be working part time on it, doing other jobs, but it just really has just eaten up all my time. And so this is where we find ourselves. And I don't really have a particular ambition to go and, like, I'd love to get a job as an engineer at company X and work on 3D printer firmware for them. I would much rather be free to just get up every day, work on Marlin for the community. And you know, I'm essentially out there. The Patreon was set up at a time when I was broke and homeless. Essentially, I was living in my friend's bread truck, and that was, you know, a strange time. But I had been moving around and kind of trying a few things.
That was Portland, though.
I wanted to escape web development, and it was boring the hell out of me. And this was the space where things were really interesting and where I felt my talents could be best applied. So it kind of just naturally fell into place, but it wasn't my intention to become full-time. It's funny, but it just happened that way. And here we are today. So yeah, that's the essence of it. It's me, and I'm trying to reach a level again above my rent and food expenses, where I can start to offer more bounties and things. So that ultimately, I'm going to continue to push the Patreon, but there are other possibilities if people would like to contribute. And of course, we're always happy to accept, like, equipment, anything that isn't working with Marlin at this time, or some printer that Marlin can't run on. I'd love to have it to try and start getting Marlin running on it. And, you know, things like that are kind of, that's where my main emphasis is. I really want to get the pieces and parts we need to keep it moving forward more than anything else.
Yeah. Gustner said in the chat, Scott, said about Gina is the main developer of Octoprint and does a lot of the work, but there are others who contribute to it, and there's always someone needed to QC these codes and merge them nicely. He said, so you do a great job.
Yeah.
Good.
Thanks. Yeah.
Control. Yeah.
Yeah, we're definitely trying to get more of that QC and more of that, like, you know, stuff happening. That was one of the things that was really a bottleneck for me. Was I get up every day and I'd work on code, fix, and then, you know, a week would go by before I'd really get a chance to test. And now it's like I have this pull request for the gradient mixing and stuff, and I'm like, guess what? It's ready. Here you go, Lou. Put it on the A10, put it on the A20. Let me know how it goes. I've got other stuff to do. And so while he's doing that, I'm working on the next thing. And it's nice we can work in parallel, and I can continue on without having to break my flow in code brain to go and do testing. And oftentimes it just comes down to that. It's just I'm really in the flow with the code, and I just don't feel like breaking out the filament and unloading and reloading and dealing with all that. And so
yeah, it's a whole other mind state that you have to get into.
For sure.
You go from coding to mechanical stuff. Just speaking as you know, a coder and jack of all trade guy, having to do codes and then do mechanical testings.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, when you got to do all that stuff, it's just like, you got a weekend project at home and you go to start doing it, and 2 hours later, you realize that you're not even working on what you originally planned to. So if you don't have traction, you can focus on the code and just keep coding until you get the shits of it.
And you have noticed, like, most companies do not let the coder be the QC person.
Yep.
There's good reason for that, is that we coders, we don't like to encounter our bugs, and so we sort of like subconsciously avoid them. I'm not going to go near that code because it'll probably invoke that bug I know is there.
Yeah, and there's a great advantage to having specialists focusing on an area, and they can just keep running, doing the same thing over and over again, and you can get better results. You don't necessarily get better people, but you get better results at whatever you're doing.
Yeah, and frankly, there's something to be said for. I love the fact that when we do a beta or release candidate, a lot of people who may not have wanted to install bug fix blah 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 from yesterday will be happy to install beta 3 just to see how it's working and see and then we get feedback that we wouldn't ordinarily get. That helps a lot. So so I would like to do some kind of release ahead of Murph, if only to really kind of get that feedback. And if it turns out that it's embarrassingly alpha or pre-alpha, we'll find that out pretty quickly, I think. But that's part of the thing, is I don't necessarily have a list of all the things that need to be done in each platform. I only know that there's some holes. Things like NeoPixel, isn't on all 32-bit boards yet because we don't have a library for it. But I know that someone will put that together pretty soon, so not too worried about it. Put it out as beta, and we'll, someone will do it when they really want it. So yeah, so ordinary user feedback matters to me as much as expert feedback, and sometimes more, because especially in the terms of the user experience, I want to know when you first come to a printer, what confuses you? Like what makes sense. We're all used to seeing certain things and certain phrases and certain terms, but what does a new user see when they come to it? I know for me, it was definitely very new and strange, and I can't imagine now, with all the experience I have, what it would be like again for a newbie. So newbies, please, I need your feedback too.
We'll give everybody a couple minutes here in the chat. I don't want to keep holding Scott up because, as he did say, we are to blame tonight for the lack of development happening on Marlin. So
yeah, blocking development here.
Yeah.
Right. More testing.
I'd absolutely love to thank you guys for coming on tonight. Normally, we don't go for 3 hours nonstop like this. I mean, usually there's some pauses and breaks in there. I mean, this conversation, I feel like maybe we could do a part 2 in a few months, maybe get past Marlin 2.0 release. And maybe do this again if you guys would be up for it.
Yeah, I'd be into it. I'm sure, but at that point, we'll be getting a lot more feedback from people who are like actually running these things on 32-bit boards and upgrading their systems, and that would be a great time to talk about how it's going.
Okay. Dave and Chris, do you guys have any additional questions that weren't asked tonight?
Yeah, actually, I do have one. And Scott, I'm trying to remember. conversation you and I had back at Murph last year, but you had mentioned earlier that you worked on some Amiga and some Atari games in the 80s, and I think you might have worked on maybe a couple PC games too. Anything that folks might recognize? You got a lot of folks on here that played with those 2600 cartridges and some other games. So,
well, of course, nowadays you can get an emulator, so you can always run all the old software. If you have an Amiga emulator, go ahead and get yourself a copy of Dino Wars or Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, and you'll find my coding credit on both of those. I wrote the port of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure for Amiga using a custom game engine that I was working on at the time, and I wrote Dino Wars on the Amiga as my first attempt to learn 68,000 assembly and and work on the Amiga computer. And both of those are now available as downloads that you can run on your UAE emulator. As for the Atari, that's the Atari 400, 800 computer that I used to program on, and nothing I wrote for that exists anymore, except for one disk editor called the Tracer, which you can find on archive.org and run on an Atari 800 emulator. It's in ATR format, and it's called the Tracer. And it's not even the final version. It's like some interim version. The final one had like a 68,000, a 6502 disassembler in it and stuff. It was pretty cool. And a little scripting language for modifying disks in case you wanted to, set a 0 here in that sector and write a 3 in that other sector, and then it was meant to be a kind of a pirating tool for your Ataris. But anyway, the main gist of the program was to fix your directory and free up any blocks that weren't marked unused and stuff like that, and fix up broken files and things, and look into your files, and kind of do some hacking. But yeah, at that time, that was in the late 80s, early 90s that I was working on the Amiga. And yeah, that was a really fun platform to work on. I think it probably runs at the same general clock rate as an AVR Arduino does today. And yet it had all these coprocessors, so you could do amazing graphics and sound with it. It was a really cool computer to work on, and it definitely that era of programming, that time when you had the Apple II and there was the Homebrew Computer Club and stuff, has always reminded me of this kind of modern era of AVRs and Adafruit and tweaking and electronics, and this kind of hobbyist thing was dead for a while, and it seems to be making a real resurgence. We don't build ham radios now, but we build all kinds of other cool things. And maybe, and some of us even build analog and digital computers. It's amazing. So, there's a whole realm of STEAM that's, what is that? Technology, art, engineering, STEAM. STEM, yeah.
Science, technology, engineering, math, manufacturing.
And don't forget art. So yeah, the whole STEM thing is very much, and the maker, movement, so to speak, is kind of just a resurgence of that spirit, and I really love seeing it. And that's, to me, that's what working on Marlin is all about. It's sort of being in the center of that whole storm, of that whole revolution, and I don't know. I just love being a part of it. So I'm happy to have been part of this.
I was going to say, you said forget art, but I've been doing a lot of talks lately, and I've been talking to organizations that are running STEAM, which is the science, technology, engineering, art, and math.
Yeah, don't forget art.
In there.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Don't forget the A.
That's right.
STEAM, baby.
Don't worry, it's coming back.
And then when you send your child to a Catholic school, they have STREAM. You can figure out what the R is.
Regression?
I thought you guys were talking about STEAM with 2 E's, which is another basically funding contributors, funding creators website. Not like Patreon, but more more like Reddit, but if you click upvote, the more upvotes there are, the more money the contributor gets. I've got a Steam account, but I've made like 2 pennies.
Yeah, I'm not too worried about that. I mean, if I was a content creator, there's definitely a lot more options if you were like a YouTuber content creator making something entertaining or informative. I mean, this is a really kind of unprecedented thing. I think most Patreons are probably built around, and successful ones are built around YouTube channels. And this is a little different where, yeah, I have a YouTube channel, but that's just there for, you know, I like to occasionally show off what I'm working on code-wise and educate people about the code inner workings of Marlin or whatever. It's infotainment of a certain kind, but it's definitely not, you know, your 5-minute science video about black holes, which I think are great, and I love to see supporters doing well on those. So it's an interesting to try and experiment with it as a non-content creator. And yet it has been fairly successful. And the thing is that a lot of that has to do with, you know, YouTube and content creators. If it weren't for their audiences and their followers, we wouldn't have the influx of people coming over and looking at, you know, what kind of stuff is being done in open source development, which may not be fun to watch, but and entertaining, but it is something of value and that people as a community value a lot. So yeah, I like it. It's interesting. It's fascinating.
Yeah, with Steam, it's more like Reddit. However, instead of getting upvotes and getting someone gifting you Go or whatever, all the upvotes contribute to basically, you know, they sell ads, and if your article, whatever it is you submitted, gets a lot of views, then you get a percentage of that ad. But you get your percentage based on how many upvotes you get.
Huh.
It's an interesting platform. I haven't been able to get it to work for me, but
yeah, I don't know that it would work for me.
Right.
In any case, I mean, I prefer.
It wouldn't work for Marlin development so much because, you know, unless you're putting out an essay, being very descriptive of everything you've done for the week or whatnot, and then people vote on that. But I think most of the stuff is more like photography, videos and stuff like that.
Yeah, it doesn't sound very cogent to my stuff. But yeah, that's the thing is I've looked at different platforms and there are some interesting ones. I believe Flatter, you know, was one someone suggested, but all of them seem to require a lot of work. I think it's better if you just have some place where it really feels like you're having a relationship and where you're establishing a relationship with your patrons. Patreon has been best for that for me. YouTube may work well for that for others, but I feel like, you know, for all its shortcomings, maybe politically or socially, that technically Patreon, and in terms of its organization, is, I think for creators, it's probably one of the better choices and maybe the best choice, just because it it establishes that direct rapport.
Did you ever check out Coffee, however that is?
No. So anything else, guys?
I threw a link in the chat to Steam's that Lou's talking about, the Steam website.
STEEM, right?
Yeah, someone mentioned that.
Steam it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to spread it around too much because it becomes diluted. I'd much rather be as much as possible engaged, and my choice has been Patreon up to this point. If people still have a distaste for it, I'm sorry. I understand. But the thing is, for me, it establishes the best rapport and direct communication. I'm able to offer rewards and other things, which I would have to do all this stuff manually and manage it myself and hire a third person if I was using Steam and Flatter and everything else. Whereas this works much better, and it really is, to me, it's important to really know and be in communication with the people who are my contributors and talk to them.
Right. Just to quickly mention, the thinkinghead.com/donate to Marlin has a lot of several different options for people to choose from, either PayPal or Patreon, and what's the other one? Make It? No, what's the other one?
I don't know. It's there. You'll see it.
Yeah.
Whatever's there today. Who knows? It'll be different when you're watching it. but right now it is what it is. So yeah, there's a few more options if you don't like Patreon. So
yeah, if you got your choices,
that's what that's all about. I hadn't set up that page for a long time, but I finally got convinced to do it by the whole Patreon kerfuffle. So
at the beginning of the stream, Nightbot was screwing up the support Marlin links that it was posting, so I shortened it so it's just taking you to the support Thinky Head page. So anybody watching, all the links are in the description that Scott gave me for where to find him on social media, how to support him. All that stuff's down in the description, as well as all of our hosts and co-hosts tonight that joined the panel. So if you are interested in supporting Marlin, and I fully encourage you to, you can support Marlin using those links. You can also go to printedsolid.com and get a $5 Marlin Inside sticker. The $5 then Printed Solid donates directly to Scott and the Marlin development.
Yep, I designed that sticker initially as a kind of a joke, but it's kind of taken off. So there you go, Marlin Inside. I would love to have T-shirts and stuff say Marlin Inside, but we'll work on that later. Yep. Just put them out there. I mean, I don't want to turn this into a big old marketing thing. I've got plenty of other stuff to do, plenty of code to work on. But if people like to, want to show off that they're a supporter of Marlin, I would love to have stuff like that, and make it, as nice rewards for people too, and start, sending off some things. That's one of the things that the patrons have been really cool about, is most of them have declined any kind of reward in favor of just supporting the project, and that's been kind of helpful because I haven't always been in the best position to be off mailing things. So, but now that things have been stabilizing and we're in a good spot right now, I want to start sending off. So, yeah, people are welcome to totally buy those stickers, but patrons, I'll probably start sending out a few to you guys. So, check your mailbox. You may randomly get a sticker just out of gratitude. So, keep an eye out.
Real quick, let's do. Unless Dave or Chris has any more questions for Scott and Lou, we'll go ahead and start with outros with Chris.
Sure. Okay, yeah, I got mute off. Chris here at mchrisp1 on Twitter. Can also look on at ERF 2018 on Twitter. ERF 2019 is coming, October 2019. So just a few. What about? Yeah, it's the second month, so yeah, 8 more months away. Wow, math gets hard at this time of night. But thank you so much, Scott, Lou, for coming on. It's been a pleasure to know you since I first met you last year. Tonight's been eye-opening, educational. I appreciate your time, both Scott and Lou. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It was great to have a chance to engage with everybody and kind of talk more about how this whole thing works, give a clearer picture of what the situation is. Because I know a lot of people probably have an idea that, Marlin Firmware is a giant ministry building in the middle of Austin, and we live on the top floor, and Marlin, comes down from the penthouse up there. But in fact, yeah, we're just a couple of geeks trying to make ends meet while Marlin Firmware takes up all our time at this point.
What he said.
And Chris, I'd like to thank you for you organized this stream tonight, getting Scott and Lou on. I'd like to thank you for the legwork that you put forth to make that contact and reach out to Scott.
My pleasure. It was easy. Scott jumped right on it. So thanks again.
That's awesome to hear. All right, your turn.
So David Randolph over at Printed Solid, and I'll say this, we're huge open source supporters, and I'll be honest with you, I really don't think Printed Solid would exist without Marlin. So that's why we do the sticker, the little sticker thing. We figured that was a good way for us to give some money, but try and get some of other people's monies behind it as well. So thank you guys for, constantly developing on it and working on it, digging there all the time. Love everything you guys do. And thanks for coming on board.
It's been a pleasure to meet you too, and work with you. Of course, yeah. Whenever we go to these events, you're my anchor man.
There you go.
You're the guy I can count on to be like, so what do you think about this scene, huh? And we'll both shake our heads and be like, yeah, this scene.
We've had some fun talks at some of these shows, so it'll be
definitely
nice to see you at Murph this year, because we got some interesting announcements for Murph this year. I'll love to hear what you say once we actually make it public.
Absolutely, totally looking forward to it.
And that comes to me. I'm Matt from How I Do It. YouTube.com/HowIDoIt. Twitter @CountryCowboy. The rest of the stuff's down in the description. As far as for the Friday night hangouts, the next Friday night hangout is the European one on February 15th at 3 p.m. Eastern, 20 UTC. That will be hosted by Marlin.
I know,
from 3D Printing Iceland, and they will be talking with Cat as their guest about 3D printing for jewelry making. Kat's been experimenting with casting in both metals and resin. I think she's looking at metal casting. She's looking at resin, or she's done resin casting to use 3D printing as just a part of jewelry making that she does.
Interesting.
That's on the 15th, and the next U.S. stream is February 22nd, 10 p.m. Eastern. That is going to be Wes Swain from Geeksmithing. Wes is a lot like I am, just a general maker, always tinkering with something. He loves technology, happens to do some 3D printing, laser cutting, all kinds of cool stuff. And we're going to bring him on and talk about how he uses 3D printing in his workflow and in the projects that he does. So we'll enjoy having everybody come back again and talk with Wes and ask him questions as well. You can follow the Friday Night Hangouts on Twitter f3dpch.com. On Twitter f3dpch. It's almost 1:30 in the morning. And you can also follow us at f3dpch.com or Friday 3D Printing Community Hangout.com, as well as youtube.com/Friday 3D Printing Community Hangout. So I'll go ahead and let Scott and Lou do their outro and close us out for the night.
Oh, before they do their outro, I got one question for those guys.
Go for it.
Why do you not have a 9-foot stuffed marlin hanging on the wall behind you? I'm just saying that just seemed like the perfect decoration.
You know, I'm afraid that we had to eat it. We were so starving. We just cut it up and ate it. So
famished.
That's
we gotta get a
lies.
new one, but,
That's lies. You didn't. You didn't.
Sorry. We'll get a new one, we swear.
No, we couldn't win it at the local Big E this year. So the Big E is the Big E's is a local fair carnival thing here.
All I can say is, hey guys, thank you for having us. It's been great. Love to come on anytime. And it's just, this is a great community to be part of, and we're glad to have been part of tonight's thing.
Yep, totally. And next time, we'll have a drawn Marlin on the wall.
Yeah, we'll do something Marlin-esque.
Something.
We appreciate having you guys on, and you guys are more than welcome to come back for any of the topics. Scott, if you want, I can add your contact information to the calendar so that you can get the links and stuff if you want to join in on a conversation in the future.
Sure.
You're more than welcome to come back as another host, even though we're going to hold up Marlin development if you do.
Well, you know, man cannot live on bread alone, or code alone, something like that.
So from all of us at the Friday Night 3D Printing Community Hangout, have a good night. For those of you in the EU who joined us late in the stream, have a good day. And thank you again to Scott and all the developers who put forth their effort to Marlin. Without you guys, a lot of us would not have the 3D printers that we do. And without that, we wouldn't have the huge community that we do. So thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Yeah.
Later all.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Have a good night.
Good night, everybody.